thank you very much, Tarek, and thanks to the principal organizers, and in particular to Professor Aksa, there you are, for the initiative and for inviting us at the Human Rights Research and Education Center to host and provide facilities. It's a pleasure to do so. I also want to underline the timeliness of the subject. I think none of us can be kind of daily watching events and situation and not realize the imperative before us of engaging on this topic, and I think with some worry, but maybe with a little bit of hope too. My remarks today are primarily going to be some reflections. As I'm getting older, you were reciting parts of my career, which is gets longer every day. I must admit to increasing concerns. I was just in the last week in a couple of back-to-back conferences, one in Geneva on double standards in international law, and in one closed meeting with the legal advisors of the chief legal advisors of a handful of intergovernmental organizations in Geneva, and a number of ambassadors, permanent representatives. I can tell you that no one's got a magic wand, and everyone is deeply worried. I'll come back to that in a moment. A few remarks, particularly on humanitarian law. Let me also share a couple of prefatory remarks. First of all, thanks to my colleagues here who have contributed organizing with the Northern Justice Watch and with the co-sponsors, and to all the speakers. I feel a bit of a charlatan here because this particular topic is not my own area of specialization, but and there are many people here much more knowledgeable than me to speak on it. We'll hear them in the course of the next 2 days. But grosso modo, I would say I've been trying to work on this topic for most of my career in a very simple way. How do we live together? How do we overcome differences and conflicts of needs and interests and aspirations, our different perceptions and conceptions of a good life, what constitutes a good society that is not one that only is sustainable in peace, but contributes to prosperity and general well-being. How do we do that? And there are many, many competing conceptions of this. I fear that in some regards, we're not only not succeeding these days, but we're falling back, and that's very troubling to observe. It's especially troubling in the field of human rights, where for longer than my career in life, one of the basic theories of change has been the idea of mobilizing shame, that with the transparent or the cleansing power of transparency, that if one were to reveal wrongdoing, violations, and expose to public scrutiny, that those responsible would feel some kind of constraint, would actually incur shame. And I think it's pretty self-evident that's not a working thesis these days, or not an effective one. We're living in an increasingly shameless world, where not only are the normal means, the work of many organizations, work I have done myself and many people in this room, of carefully cataloging human rights violations, publicizing them, bringing them to certain, the scrutiny of certain supervisory bodies and all the rest of it. This is not only falling on deaf ears, but is actually being confronted by utterly shameless persons in positions of responsibility and authority who are actively ridiculing those who would do that good work. And I think we may lament that. We may also observe the increasing reproach of double standards allegations, which are now ever more express in all sorts of fora, but that's not giving us answers of sort of how do we live together, how do we move forward. So that's kind of my preoccupation. In this subject, I'm especially concerned that what's happening is a lot of people are turning off, that there's a kind of predominant numbness
that I sense is I don't have empirical evidence of this. I think there is some empirical evidence. A number of organizations, some of which some of us in this room are part of, are increasingly observing declining numbers of membership, support, attendance, and so forth. I think this is indicative. A lot of people are exasperated, and a lot of institutions are to be blunt, failing, not living up to their own promise or their own responsibility. So this is kind of where we are. I want to go back a little bit to some basics. One of the basics, I'll just say by passing, thank you, Tarek, for the acknowledgement of Indigenous land and the affirmation with regard to respect for Indigenous peoples. We are sitting here in Ottawa and at the University of Ottawa on territory in a place and space where there are still, of course, significant numbers of the population, the community that has since time immemorial been here. We're 1.4, if you don't know, we're a $1.4 billion annual business here at the University of Ottawa. We've got about $1 billion of assets, both fixed and endowment. I was very glad that last week, finally, the University of Ottawa has offered tuition-free higher education to only Anishinaabe, not other Indigenous persons here, but at least that took that was a heavy lift over a lot of years. But you might not know, for those of you who are visiting, that this university ran the largest number of residential schools in Canada, 54 of them, of which we have not paid any compensation, reparation, nor admitted any liability. I'm not even sure if we've admitted any responsibility, although it's pretty patent. And I will also mention that people who were involved in some of those enterprises are still alive today, and I could go on. So just to say that this is an example of a pretty big gap between our kind of declared values, our aspiration. We do these. I remember some years ago, John Russell Saul was speaking, probably about 10 years ago, here in Ottawa at St. Paul University, and you may know he's written a few books about Indigenous peoples in Canada, and he already then was very concerned about the kind of rote, ritualistic articulation of land affirmations and things like that, followed by no other consequential conduct. Pretty big gap between words and deeds. So I feel moved to say that, not only as a professor of law and human rights here at the University of Ottawa, but as a director of a center of human rights. So the gap is part of the problem, part of what we're confronting in this conference, and that there are double standards, that it appears not only the conference we had last week in Geneva, organized with Harvard University, interestingly enough, which is now being, of course, attacked, and the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. Not only are there different standards applied to different actors, but the same standard applied differently to various actors. And again, those gaps are very large. So why are some groups particularly protected, other groups clearly not protected, and so forth? So I think this is in the world in which we're living, not only a problem, a conceptual problem or a problem per se, but the world in which we're living now is one of immediate visibility. The world knows this. So one of the things that was evident in Geneva is that nobody in the room, none of the international organizations, none of the governments are blind to what we're all seeing and feeling. And the result of that is that they too are kind of turning off, turning away, walking back. And I can tell you, I mean, it was a closed meeting, but I don't think she'd worry about this. The chief legal advisor to the International Committee of the Red Cross, Dr. Cordula Dorega, she admitted that she has been told by many national committees and specifically academics to kind of tone down the references to humanitarian law because professors don't want to teach it. Nobody wants to hear it because nobody believes it. It's a chief legal advisor of ICRC. For those of you who are coming from conflict situations, so forth, you'll understand this reference. But I mean, if that's where we are, this is not encouraging days or ground. So I want to go back a little bit to foundations and kind of, or what Carlson would have said, the Grundnorm. Even in international law, if we would say that equality of states, equality as a moral proposition, but also as a matter of law, is perhaps a foundational tenet. But I think I would go more specifically to say something about human dignity is more foundational. Of course, it's in Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is really an assertion more than a right. You know, it says all persons born free and equal in dignity and rights. Is that true? Is it empirically correct? I mean, easily challenged, I would say. But then it says in the second sentence, it says that they are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Should. Except they don't. So this is, you know, kind of, that's Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Rights. An assertion and then a nice kind of wishful statement. And then we have our long catalog, expanding catalog of rights and freedoms. And they themselves have all these tensions within them. And I think this conference is to address part of that. Part of that is the tension between freedom and security. So if we talk about hate and we talk about not only that, but the kind of social dynamics of polarization, we're also talking about our society, our communities. Are we secure? Are we safe to hold opinions, share opinions, to engage with others? We heard some careful remarks about ground rules here, which you know, not too many years ago we wouldn't have had to say that, but now we do say that. Because that space has been limited. But this is the challenge. How do we live with freedom, full, effective, for everyone, and yet securely, safely, and in a society that actually actively protects, actively seeks the full enjoyment? These are words that are used a lot for everyone. I draw your attention, for example, that even in the UN Charter, in Article 55, which is about the principal provision on human rights, it actually speaks about well-being. It says that the duty of the state is to contribute to the well-being of everyone. That's a broader concept than equality or than human rights. Or it's a whole kind of construct of social relations. Of course, that was partly inspired, we shouldn't forget, by Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, pronounced in 1943, so a couple of years before the UN Charter, 5 years before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and his Four Freedoms, which were explicitly articulated as a security, in a security framework. The impetus was security. And he asserted these four freedoms, in particular, the first two, freedom of speech, and then freedom of worship or belief, but also balanced against some of the limits and some of the impetus. The fourth freedom, freedom from fear, not only physical fear, but also one's peace of mind, one's confidence in one's own beliefs and one's own community. So broad framework to balance these. That of course gave rise in the Universal Declaration of Rights. We've got a handful of what we often call fundamental freedoms, which are generally about expression, association, assembly, movement. Our own charter made a little distinction on that. We took movement out of that freedoms category, and we, a couple of paragraphs later, talk about mobility rights, which is quite interesting because it's quite constrained provision, actually. A little bit less of freedom and a whole lot of limitations. But that's true for all of the fundamental freedoms. None of them are unlimited. In fact, all of them are limited. It has been elaborated through subsequent jurisprudence and philosophy that those limitations, of course, should be, or restrictions should be restrictively interpreted and applied in order that the essence of the freedom should nonetheless be vindicated. But I think we're seeing all the time, including in our own country, including with new laws, including with new, right before our city of Ottawa, this week in Toronto and elsewhere, more and more adoption of bylaws and instruments to constrain those freedoms. More and more limitations on, and I'm not now talking about the securitization of information areas, surveillance society, and so forth, the interposition by the state and private actors. I just mean the basic balance of liberty and security. So pendulum's been swinging against freedom. I mean, what we're watching on the streets in the United States of America, I don't know what word to use. Unfathomable. You know, I'm not going there for a while. It's really, nothing seems to be reliable. Everything is at risk. So are we free of fear? Not at all. Do we actually enjoy those fundamental freedoms? Not at all. So this is kind of where we are. Even if we looked at the international law provisions, if you look at the provisions, for example, Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a pretty short, simple statement about freedom of expression, but less than 20 years later in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, you don't get a sentence or two, you get multiple paragraphs, all sorts of more precise and relatively constraining limitations. So that kind of pushback from Roosevelt's very simple idea continued already then. And we're not now talking about effective implementation, that's a whole other story, and so forth, but just conceptually the normative framework. So where are we in fact? If we turn to the kind of facts, of course, and here in Canada, and not just in the world, if we look at the world, you know, Freedom House has reported, I think, 20 or 21 consecutive years of declining freedom. I think we're down to 10 democracies, full democracies in their categorization. I mean, really bad trend. Now, they've run out of adjectives. For several years they were saying, you know, it was, I can't remember all the bad words they were used, you know, we're at the precipice of disaster, and so, I mean, each year it got worse and worse. The numbers get worse and worse. So it's not good in our own country. Statistics Canada, we still have fairly reliable institutions here, so I'm going to trust them. And Statistics Canada reports in the last 10 years, there have been some bumps, by the way, of a little bit better years, but the trajectory over the last 10 years is basically a doubling of hate crimes in Canada. At least police reported hate crimes. Some of you are much more intimately aware of this than I am, but my understanding is that those are acts which would constitute crimes, for example, an assault, which is linked to a motivation that would fall under the prohibited grounds constituting hate. So that means it's still fairly small. It's about 10 cases per 100,000 persons in Canada, so that's we're relatively good in the world, but that's double what it was 10 years ago.
4 times, actually.
Is it 4 times now? Yeah. So definitely getting worse. And it's getting worse pretty much across, I shouldn't say across the board. It's actually getting specifically worse in some categories, and it's really not getting worse in some other categories. And that's interesting, at least for me, statistically. If we look at the categories of motivation, for example, hate crime motivation on Indigenous identity has remained relatively modest, or at least not the steep curve of other categories. The category that really has had the sharp increases, hate crime motivation on race or ethnicity. I'm not quite sure how they make the distinctions in some of these categories, because remarkably, the hate crime category on religion is, on the basis of religion, is nowhere near as much as race or ethnicity. How they categorize these, some of you here maybe know more. Both of those are up, but the one that's way up is race or ethnicity, according to Statistics Canada, at least between 2014 and 2024. At least that's on the internet today. I'm trusting it. I probably didn't need to tell you that, because I think we probably all know it. We can see reporting, we can feel it. And actually, I want to talk about that element. What is it that we're feeling? We're feeling it. We're feeling it here in the law school. We feel it in conferences and consultations we host. People are worried. People ask about who's coming, who's speaking, what are the terms. We have close relationship with the security services of the, I mean, all these things have happened in the last few years, which I think are indicative of kind of where we're at. Because what's accompanied this is, these probably doesn't show up in these statistics because these are not police-reported crimes. But a general sense of reduced civility or incivility, of insecurity, just in terms of readiness of people to reach out, how people, many people, very much concerned. I work a lot with exiled activists in different parts of the world, now confronting online forms of hate that are extreme, I would say, attacks and the kind of forms of attacks. So now serious preoccupation over data protection, surveillance, online. So there's a general atmosphere that I think the statistics that I've just reported are not reflective of. In other words, I'm arguing it's a worse situation than the statistics indicate. And that has all sorts of implications if we're talking about well-being and the character of society and what full and effective freedom actually means. I think that the situation is not good and getting worse. Where do we look to get things better? Well, we normally look to our institutions. We look domestically, we look internationally, and I have to say they are not doing super well either. So they're late, generally late. Part of my own criticism, and I will declare that I'm on Canada's Committee for Human Rights Watch, for example, so I have no hesitancy to criticize some of these organizations. A lot of the human rights organizations, their own methodology is basically reactive, post facto. They collect violations, that means after things have happened. Then they catalog the complaints, and then they send them, they publish them, or they send them to unpaid rapporteurs with one or half staff person in Geneva who do what? Publish them in collective reduced things, and not much happens. So, this is where we are. I can tell you I have a lot of associates, activists in different countries who have outsized expectations of these institutions somehow coming to the rescue to do something which they're absolutely not going to do. So, I'm painting a troubling picture because it is a troubled picture. Right now, the big preoccupation, if you're not aware, within the United Nations, we'll hear a bit tomorrow morning from the United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, and you can ask her questions. But the big preoccupation is financial downsizing and forced transfers and movements. So people in very comfortable lives in Geneva and New York, I was just there, and now being asked that they might have to move to Nairobi, God forbid, or maybe if they're a little bit luckier, to Vienna. I'm not kidding you. This is the number one thing on the minds of staff members right now. So they are not thinking about what we're talking about. They're preoccupied. We can argue, well, that's important. They've got kids in school in Geneva, and they have to worry about that too. But just for you to know where they are. So the system isn't working. I think nationally, we had the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau in 2015. One of his big bywords is "we're back. We're going to repair all sorts of things." To my understanding, the budget of the Canadian Commission on Human Rights has still never been fully restored. All sorts of institutions, Commission on Status of Women, and many other things, simply not supported. A number of what are sometimes called the fourth sector of government, ombudsmen, commissions, labor boards, all these kind of institutions which do the real meat and potatoes of helping society work and addressing complaints proactively without having to pay lawyers or get through hurdles to pursue, for example, before a court of law, your rights. A lot of those institutions are weak and under-supported. And there doesn't seem to be much of a clamor for making them a lot more effective, a lot more supported. So that means that we're vulnerable. We're socially, politically, institutionally vulnerable. We have a government, last government, but same Liberal Party government, that did appoint the Prime Minister two special envoys or representatives, one on Islamophobia, the other on anti-Semitism and Holocaust remembrance. So I can't remember the full title. To my observation, that's not the full alpha and omega of problems of hate speech or anything in society by any means. I mean, that's the result of lobbying of certain groups and really political calculations. I mean, if one's really serious about things like hate speech, why we don't have a czar on hate speech in general, right? Why we don't have effective mechanisms. I think a lot of this is performative, is tokenistic. They were almost hardly funded at all. A couple of staff members, very limited, not robustly supported politically. You would think that they would be very strongly supported. So I think that this is also indicative of where we are. I want to turn a little bit to online matters. I won't take too much more time. What's changed? We had a discussion in Geneva on double standards for a lot of different actors, and we said, well, what's changed in your view? Because the double standards accusation is not new at all. It's an old thing. Exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, and there are other versions of that in the world. And many people say, well, that's political reality. People will use what they can politically. But some things have changed. Certainly, social media, or the character media communications, the instantaneous character of it. I remember, this is just anecdotal, but a couple of years ago, I can't remember if he was the editor of The Atlantic or a major American magazine, who had been, a normal American total free speech advocate his whole life, and he suddenly said, I've completely changed. And what changed for him was he said, well, we used to be able to rely upon retractions, corrections, courts, someone could sue. He said, with social media, you can't do that because it's so instantaneous and the multiplication is the reach is so extensive. I mean, before you even called your lawyer, it's all gone. So the reality of the world in which we now live, where it's difficult to trace people and so forth, we need a different approach. And he became an advocate of a regulated internet, for example. We're not there, and I'm just going to draw your attention that in 2016, the United Nations, under the then Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, produced a special report and held a series of consultations on freedom of expression and states and the private sector in the digital age. And dated 2016 is the publication, and it's kind of shocking to read it now because it's essentially protecting the private sector. It's saying, well, you got to be careful not to interfere, because that's a limitation, and we're against limitations and so forth. I mean, it's almost surreal to read the report. This is a UN special rapporteur, right? Well, in 2023, about a year and a half ago, or almost 2 years ago, now July 2023, another special rapporteur, a subsequent special rapporteur, together with the UN, developed a set of guidelines on the policymakers, practitioners on online speech, and of course they come to the opposite conclusion, right? So they kind of caught up with the technology, but it's kind of too late, to try and now get what we're seeing. What's the phrase? Closing the barn doors after the horse has bolted. But in fact, calling for regulation, legislation, more technical control, but still asking a lot of self-regulation, which I don't think is going to work in this era. So I have to say I'm not that confident of that. Okay, I'd like to end with to talk about something different, which is I find troubling, is the kind of spirit and even the use of terminology now. We used to think it was a good thing to teach empathy, sympathy. If we use notions like well-being, even in military contexts, the notions of chivalry and so forth. And if you listen now carefully, what we're hearing are opposite ideas. The UN Secretary of Defense is talking about we need war fighters, we need to celebrate lethality. That's exactly what it is, lethality. Not chivalry, not defense, not security. We want to kill. And we want people who will kill on automatic orders, get rid of all this woke humanitarian law and so forth. I think this kind of turn where some places, for example, some states in the US have now made it unlawful to teach empathy. Just let that sink in for a moment. Unlawful to teach empathy. I don't know how you live together with persons who you disagree. And the book burnings that are going on, just last week, the replacement in the Pentagon, and all American defense, or I hesitate to use the word defense, American military installations, all their libraries they've had to throw out all books with words like gender, diversity. It's just kind of bizarre. At the same time, there's another kind of perverse invocation of some normal vocabulary like protection. So now, at the same time, in order to protect vulnerable groups, places, spaces, and so forth, yet more constraints, but on kind of selective bases, are being invoked. Of course, we want protected spaces. There are we're in a protected space. There are limitations, or there are freedoms, special freedoms, in academic freedom, for example, freedom of speech, virtually unlimited in Parliament, or for judges and others. We want those areas, but be careful. Watch how these terms are now being used. Protection, but exactly how, for whom, by whom, and so forth. So I think that we're starting to see, the word comes to my mind is perverse invocations that are not committed to the fundamental conceptual, the Gurn norm of human dignity. That is not their impetus or their driving goal, but is in fact to advantage some, to disadvantage others, to control, to these ideas of for us, not for them, really duplicitous or unequal. And I think the path we're on right now is not going to resolve in any kind of positive way without a very big conversation, I hope a little bit we can contribute to here in the next 2 days, about the fundamental basics and how do we live together? How do we find that balance of freedom and security in the days in which we live? So I'm sorry I'm not very encouraging. It's not how I'm feeling at the moment, which is an empirical statement, but I think we have to kind of be a bit sober, maybe a bit honest amongst ourselves, and that includes scrutinizing the normal things we've advocated, the normal methodologies. I think we have to acknowledge that we've hit some walls. These are not convincing, these are not working, and we have to be open to thinking, okay, how do we go forward? How do we find that way to find a real, effective, equal freedom and dignity for everyone, everywhere? Thank you very much.
I'm fine with this, yeah. everybody. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation and for organizing this important event. I'm going to not promise anything sunnier than what you've just heard, but I am going to be a bit more technical, I guess, and maybe that will give us some stuff to think about, chew over, and work with. I find that resorting to the tools of whatever trade you have, in my case it's law, has been what I've done to cope with some of the difficult emotions that I've been feeling over the last several months, maybe the last 2 years or so. And being able to take something that's a tool or to exercise a craft that you have, whether it's writing or researching or advocating in whatever way, and just doing something about something has for me been brought some relief. I want to begin. I do have slides in an effort to retain your attention and give you something to look at while you listen to me. I hope they align with what I'm saying. In liberal democracies, the presumption is that individuals who constitute the state enjoy rights and freedoms, which includes the right to express opinions and beliefs freely. And that includes the expression of hateful ideas and opinions. As a rule, the liberal democratic state does not tell its citizens what to think or say. As such, under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the state has the constitutional duty not to unjustifiably restrict freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression as per Section 2B of the Charter. But it also has a constitutional duty to protect equality before and under the law, and that's contained in Section 15 of the Charter, which also includes a permission for the state to take affirmative action to promote equality. And that's necessary because we know that tolerating hate in society leads to greater inequality. Empirically, that is a fact. So this knowledge of this tension leads to the question: should freedom of expression be curtailed in the name of chilling or restraining hate and trying to engineer a more inclusive society? In my talk, I want to focus on two things. I'm going to describe the ways in which the criminal law on the one hand and the human rights law on the other hand regulate hate domestically. So I appreciate the international context setting that John provided. I'm not going to talk about the international realm at all. And then I'm going to offer some analysis and observations about law reform proposals generally and specifically, because there are law reform proposals that are on the table right now. So let me turn to criminal law. You might be surprised to know that hate and discrimination are not actually defined concepts in Canadian legislation. The law refers to these terms, but it doesn't define them. It relies on the courts to give us those definitions. So the Supreme Court of Canada ends up being the ultimate authority on defining hate, which it did in a 1990 decision that is still the governing authority. It defines hatred or describes hatred as follows: hatred is not a word of casual connotation. To promote hatred is to instill detestation, enmity, ill will, and malevolence in another. Clearly, the court said, an expression must go a long way before it qualifies within the hate speech, the hate propaganda definition of the criminal code. Hatred, the court said, is predicated on destruction, and hatred against identifiable groups therefore thrives on insensitivity, bigotry, and destruction of both the target group and the values of our society. Hatred in this sense is the most extreme emotion that belies reason, an emotion that, if exercised against members of an identifiable group, implies that those individuals are to be despised, scorned, denied respect, and made subject to ill treatment on the basis of group affiliation. Whoops. Okay. Okay, so the criminal code contains two principal prohibitions relating to hate propaganda. There is no hate speech law, or there is no hate crime in the criminal code per se, although I'll get to talking a little bit about what's proposed in a moment. At present, we have two principal prohibitions: public incitement, which is section 319, sub 1, and the willful promotion of hatred, which is section 319, sub 2. There is no hate crime. To trigger the public incitement offense, there must be statements that are made in public that incite hatred against an identifiable group, and there must be a likelihood of violence, objectively ascertained. As for the willful promotion of hatred, which is the crime I think that most people are thinking about when they talk about hate speech crime, the crime of hate speech, is triggered when you have a public statement that willfully promotes hatred against an identifiable group. That's the test. It requires a specific intentionality, and it's a high bar. But that is the crime. That is the criminalization of words spoken, and it is really the only instance of that, the only that exception to the general prohibition on criminalizing speech. We find it in the willful promotion of hatred. Now, in 2022, a new crime was added. That's sections 319 sub 2.1, which is the willful promotion of anti-Semitism, which obviously targets the condoning, denying, or downplaying of the Nazi Holocaust. It's not clear to me what the difference is between the promotion of hatred against an identifiable group and the promotion of anti-Semitism. The former clearly would include the latter, which I think should be raising lots of alarm then as to what this new crime is intended to affect. And perhaps not surprisingly, in related events, the definition of anti-Semitism itself is a topic of considerable public controversy, as political interests aligned with the State of Israel seek to push a redefinition of anti-Semitism to serve a pro-Israel agenda. Here I'm talking about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance Association, or sorry, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism, which comes along with a series of illustrative examples of anti-Semitism, which, if implemented in Canadian law, and there is a push to implement in Canadian law, would undermine, in my opinion, not strengthen the fight against hate and discrimination. We've already seen evidence of this. We've seen discriminatory impact of this new anti-Semitism at a time when Palestinian, Muslim, Arab, and other racialized Canadians and their allies are standing up against genocide and need to use their freedom of expression more than ever. They need their freedom of association, they need their freedom of assembly, and they are seeing a diminished right of access to these charter rights as a result of the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And so all of this needs to be regarded with a healthy degree of skepticism and concern. A further relevant criminal code provision that might sometimes be colloquially referred to as a hate speech provision would be section 318, which creates the crime of advocating genocide. This section has been enforced, there are cases, but I'm not aware of any charges being laid against anyone in relation to the ongoing current genocide in Gaza, despite the prevalence of its cheerleaders among us. Finally, it's worth mentioning that crimes reported colloquially as hate crimes, as I've said, tend to refer to generic offenses where there's a hate motivation, and not a hate crime per se. Section 718.2 of the Criminal Code provides, as you see on the screen, that where there's evidence of a motive of bias, prejudice, or hate based on race, national or ethnic origin, language, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability, and so on. These are all the grounds, the same grounds that you find in the Canadian Human Rights Act. that should be accounted for in the sentence, i.e. that should lead to a stiffer sentence. Meanwhile, we also have police forces who have taken it upon themselves to develop hate crimes units as a matter of their policing practice, which seek to proactively prevent hate crimes and promote an inclusive society. According to some criminal justice critics, these units are susceptible to political bias and corruption and deserve some attention in terms of their usefulness in combating hate. For some time, there's been political pressure to amend the criminal code to beef it up to fight hate, both online hate and offline hate. Not all communities that experience hate and discrimination in Canadian society view the law as protective. For many of these communities, in fact, the law, its institutions, its officers, are part of their oppression, not part of their remedy. The push to beef up the criminal law comes clearly from those who believe that the criminal justice system belongs to them and serves them. Of course, the criminal justice system should belong to all of us and should serve all of us, but it doesn't. In 2021, legislation called Bill C-36 was introduced to regulate online hate speech, but when the proposed law sparked furious debate, it ultimately died on the floor of Parliament when an election was called. That law has been revived, or at least the spirit of that law has been revived, and it's generating some similar consternation and debate. In February 2024, Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act, was introduced. It proposes wide-ranging changes to the law in an attempt to regulate social media activity, and among its many goals is targeting hatred. It includes a new definition of hatred, to my eye, for a first attempt at that, a new actual hate crime of offense motivated by hatred, which would convert any ordinary offense into a hate crime if that motive were to be found, and and would carry a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. So it's upping the ante considerably from where we are already at in terms of the power of the criminal law. It also ups the maximum life sentence, the maximum sentence of life imprisonment for promoting genocide as well. So it's strengthening the existing hate propaganda offenses. In my opinion, if we're going to have laws like this on the books, and I don't necessarily support having laws like this on the books, but if we do have them on the books, I sincerely hope to see prosecutions of Canadians who openly advocate for the destruction of Gaza and justify the killing of children. I don't think we will. We don't know exactly how a beefier hate crimes regime would work, but what is clear is that it will put more hands in the power of police. And it's not clear, I mean, maybe others here have greater expertise on this, but it's not clear that there's evidence that suggests the lack of police power actually leads to more hate crimes or to less effective hate crime fighting. If there were such evidence, I think that would certainly bolster the case for more police powers, but those are not typically the arguments you see justifying greater police power. Okay, so I'm a skeptic when it comes to over-reliance on the law to solve social problems. I think it's unrealistic and it risks distracting from more important work. No doubt the law can be a factor in influencing human behavior. It is, obviously. But I think it's also very clear that the problem of bigoted action and hate will not be solved solely or primarily through criminal law enforcement. We do have human rights law. Let me turn to that briefly before I finish. Unlike the criminal law, human rights law provides a statutory civil prohibition on discrimination and harassment in stipulated settings like work, housing, the receipt of goods and services, etc. Like criminal law, human rights law does not define hatred, leaves it to the courts to do so. We have just 4 jurisdictions in Canada: Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, and the Northwest Territories. That's out of a total of 14 jurisdictions. 4 of them include civil damages for hate speech or for the publication of hateful material. The other provinces have no human rights provisions pertaining to hate speech. They do, obviously, pertaining to discrimination, and sometimes discrimination will take the form of words, but no specific prohibition on hate. In the federal jurisdiction, the Canadian Human Rights Act had a section 13, which targeted hateful communications. Originally,
so the second panel will have the theme of roots of polarization, and it's going to be moderated by Dr. Dawood Akça from Lakehead University. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and start with our first speaker, Mr. Evan Balgord. Evan Balgord is the Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, CAHN. He holds an Honours Bachelor of Science from the University of Toronto, where he double majored in psychology and sociology, and is a graduate of the Munk School of Global Affairs Fellowship in Global Journalism. Since 2017, Evan has been a leading voice warning about the rise of far-right movements in Canada that promote racism, hate, ideologies incompatible with a multicultural and pluralistic society. Under Evan's leadership, the Canadian Anti-Hate Network works to expose, disrupt, and counter far-right extremism in Canada. CAHN shares high-quality information to inspire advocacy and action by publishing news, investigations, and analysis, developing educational toolkits and guides, conducting workshops, and engaging with policymakers and journalists. Founded in 2018, CAHN is an independent, anti-fascist, and non-partisan nonprofit committed to building a just and inclusive society where everyone can live safely and without fear. Thanks for joining us. Now, the second speaker, this is Victoria Couquet. Unfortunately, wasn't able to join us in person due to health concerns, but she will be joining live on Zoom. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce her as well, so that in between the speeches, we're not going to disrupt them. Victoria Couquet is a Public Policy Forum Fellow and Digital Director of Corporate Engagement at Catalyst Canada, the Canadian arm of a global non-for-profit working to build workplaces that work for women. She is the host of Democracy Dialogues, a series of conversations about building a vibrant and inclusive democracy produced by Toronto Metropolitan University's Democratic Engagement Exchange. Victoria also acts as an advisor to the Canadian Internet Registration Authority's 2024 Canadian Internet Governance Forum Conference and sits on the MLSE Foundation's Community Action Grant Selection Circle Committee. She was a 2022 Civic Action Diversity Fellow. She holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in English literature from the University of Toronto. In 2023, she was one of the select cohort of students to participate in the inaugural MILA Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute Global Summer School in Responsible AI and Human Rights. Victoria, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me this morning. It's great to be with you, at least virtually.
Do you prefer the mic or wireless mic?
How does this one sound?
Good enough?
Good enough for everybody? I can be quite loud. Okay. So hello. So my name's Evan. I've been monitoring far-right groups for almost 10 years now, first as a journalist and then as a co-founder and the executive director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, where, as he said, our mission is to provide high-quality information that equips and inspires people to take actions against the far right. Our short version of a definition of the far right is as follows. We define the far right as movements that harbor racism and other forms of hate that are incompatible with our multicultural and pluralistic democracy. When we're talking about greater polarization today, I think that we are talking about the rise of far-right politics and far-right politics becoming more mainstream. And on the other side, people fighting back against that trend. Today, I'm going to talk about the rapid growth in the far right in Canada that we've been observing since about 2016. And I'll also note at the same time, hate crimes and hate incidents have been getting worse, as John pointed out, and invited any of us to talk about that. So I'm going to depart from my original remarks for a moment and let me share some information about hate crime statistics. Recent research published by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation says 1 in 6 Canadians say they have definitely or possibly experienced a hate crime in the last year. Only a quarter of those report to police for a variety of reasons. And of those who do report, only a few report a satisfactory outcome. Most say that nothing came of it. Even when that's reported to the police do not necessarily report it forward to Statistics Canada. As a result, only about 1% of hate crime is reflected in the Statistics Canada statistics reported by police. 1%. Which, as anybody who studies data science will tell you, is not really enough to draw conclusions from. I believe the only thing we should use the police reported data for is how to evaluate how well the police are actually dealing with hate crime, and the answer is poorly. If you want more on that, including all the methodological issues with that data, I wrote a piece several years back that's still valid on our website, antihate.ca. I believe the title of it is Police Only Found 1% of Hate Crimes in Canada. So back onto topic, why is the far right growing? Why is the far right message resonating more with masses of people over the past 10 years or so? This is too much of a topic to discuss in one sitting, so I'm going to focus on just a few important factors. The first of which is the concept of aggrieved entitlement. Aggrieved entitlement was studied leading up to Trump's first campaign run and got a lot of attention around then. And this is the concept that groups of people believe that they should be doing better relative to other groups of people, even if they are all economically hurting. This creates a hostile resentment to people they perceive as getting more representation in society, which explains the hate not just towards immigrants, but transgender people, women, and other groups. It also explains why it's not only white men who participate in far-right movements, but this aggrieved entitlement can happen between and across groups. This is all happening at a time when the rich are getting richer and the rest of us are doing with less. This makes people feel less secure and more fearful, and this can only make things worse. This can only be compounding or introducing people to narratives of aggrieved entitlement. And I do want to point out that economics doesn't entirely explain aggrieved entitlement. And in doing so, I'll share a story from a colleague of mine. A woman in high school around the time when women and girls started to call themselves feminists and saying they wouldn't accept certain behaviors from men and boys any longer. She and other women and girls experienced an extreme backlash and hatred from men and boys as a result. This hate had nothing to do with economics. It had everything to do with aggrieved entitlement and men and boys having their power over women and entitlement to women be challenged. There exists a whole propaganda industry that feeds this sense of aggrieved entitlement. Stories about immigrants and crime, the dangerous and inciting lie that transgender and queer people are pedophiles. And with the internet and social media, this kind of propaganda can be created quickly, easily by anybody, anywhere, spread rapidly, and oftentimes monetized, so there is a financial motive. Live streamers and content creators have become a very large part of our lives. We probably all listen to podcasts here. We probably all have sort of a friendly relationship with the podcast host. We invite them into our ears and we sort of feel a friendship or a kinship with them. That's a parasocial relationship. The far right is excellent at cultivating these parasocial relationships and communicating with their audience. Alex touched on the Diagolon network in the context of the convoy earlier. Diagolon is excellent at this. We have a forthcoming report on them that has not yet been released, but I'll quote from it. Over approximately 4 years, Diagolon has grown from a small collective of live streamers and their audiences to a large and interconnected network holding in-person meetups and a cross-country tour. They have attracted the attention of law enforcement and security services and have been discussed in national news stories. The views that are expressed by Diagolon borrow from conspiracy theories ubiquitous among the far right. The Great Replacement theory, global plots orchestrated by Jewish cabals, accusations of widespread pedophilia by 2S LGBTQ+ people. All of this packaged with uniquely Canadian nationalism. The community's leaders endorse and network with established militant white nationalist organizations. This has culminated in the leaders forming a new organization that, unlike Diagolon, has formal membership requirements. They're calling this group Second Sons Canada. Our forthcoming report will go into all of that. We have far-right ecosystems, more mainstream outlets like Fox News, social media echo chambers, and far-right content creators that all spread far-right propaganda that feeds into this concept of aggrieved entitlement. But there is some hope. A study from the Journal of Youth Sciences goes into the concept of aggrieved entitlement. And they find that people don't necessarily grow in grieved entitlement when there are bad economic times. Some people recognize that there are systems that are hurting them, and especially other people who have less privilege and are marginalized. Promoting that class consciousness and class solidarity may be part of a solution. Building communities that are resilient to narratives of aggrieved entitlement may be a multi-generational, multicultural project, but it's worth doing. I think I've discussed a bit here how fixing the economy wouldn't really be a silver bullet to fixing racism and other forms of hate. But I do think that income and wealth inequality and the fear that comes with that makes people vulnerable to far-right narratives and explains a lot of why the rapid growth of the far-right and why it's happening right now. By addressing it, maybe we could slow down or reverse that trend. So that is why people may be more attracted right now, or at least a couple factors there. But we haven't really talked too much about who is doing the attracting. The far-right people, organizations, and movements doing that work. So here in Canada, like I said, I started this work around 2016. Inspired by groups in Europe and inspired by rhetoric of then candidate Donald Trump, we had the formation of an anti-Muslim movement that began holding regular demonstrations in public squares. Quite a lot of them at Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto, quite a lot of them I observed in person. Included among those anti-Muslim demonstrators were white nationalists and neo-Nazis, and also Christian nationalists. And I should define a Christian nationalist here. So a Christian nationalist is not your everyday Christian. They have particular beliefs that this country is formed on Christian values and that it should be governed that way. So they don't believe in church and state. They believe that they can tell a woman not to get an abortion. They believe that marriage is just for a straight guy and a straight woman. And they really hate it when schools try to teach kids that it is okay to be part of the LGBTQ plus community. So this anti-Muslim movement, it sputtered out eventually, and they moved on to other movements, one of which was called Yellow Vest Canada. Yellow Vest Canada claimed to be a lot about oil and gas and Western separation. But a lot of the people who were involved in that previous anti-Muslim movement were part of the formation of Yellow Vest Canada. So you could go to the early Yellow Vest Canada pages as they were developing and growing extremely rapidly, mostly on Facebook, and you would see the same sort of hatred towards Muslims. And anybody who called it out would be kicked out of the group. They did their own convoy, which was called United We Roll, which was sort of a blueprint for the so-called Freedom Convoy or the occupation of Ottawa that happened later. Some of the people who organized that United We Roll convoy were also organizers of the so-called Freedom Convoy. I don't think I need to get too into that because I think Alex did a good job describing that. But I will point out that the pandemic was a boon for these far-right movements who traffic in conspiracies and attracted a lot of people to their spaces with their genuinely held or COVID conspiracy theories against health measures and so on and so forth. Past the convoy now, the most recent thing perhaps has been the parental rights movement. And this has seen a tenuous and brief allegiance between conservative Muslims and these Christian nationalists who are coming together over a desire to see books or education that represents queer people not be taught to their children. There were some Christian nationalist groups that severed those ties because, again, they are Islamophobic. So that organizing has somewhat been put on the back burner. Flash forward to what's really happening right now. These groups that were doing parental rights and the Christian nationalists are training political operatives to hide the extent of their true beliefs, use the right talking points, and get elected at school board and city hall levels. It is a sophisticated and Canada-wide training program they are undergoing, getting some advice from the United States. In terms of solutions, short and medium term, how do we deal with this growing far right? We believe we have to raise the cost for participating and disrupt their organizing. To that end, we recently published a guide, 40 Ways to Fight the Far Right, which goes into ways to raise the social consequences of their participating in these movements. To Faisal's point of who the law serves, I share his skepticism. One of the things I would hope for would be meaningful and diverse civilian oversight of police and prosecutors, although I wouldn't necessarily say I'm hopeful about it. I also would support the return of Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, which gave recourses directly to people to file a complaint about hate, and gave them some form of a recourse that did not require the go-ahead of police and prosecutors. It is fraught and complicated, and it also would require quite a lot of additional resourcing for the Canadian Human Rights Commission and Tribunal. I also believe that we should be making social media companies file and abide by safety plans, perhaps at least on par with what's going on in Europe. The former government promised and failed to do anything about social media companies, and I'm not going to pretend that I am an expert or that I have all the answers. But the current wild, wild west that is social media, spreading mis and disinformation, hatred towards people, it cannot continue. Long term, as I touched on, I think people need their basic needs to be met in a just and inclusive economy, because I think that makes the far-right narratives, the far-right lies, a whole lot less appealing to a broad segment of the population. And I think it would assist in building those kind of communities that can be resistant to aggrieved entitlement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Evan. Now we can move on to Victoria's presentation, please. Victoria, you can go ahead. You can share your screen if you like.
Thank you very much, and it's such a pleasure to be here. So first of all, I'm a Digital Democracy Fellow at the Public Policy Forum and the Director of Corporate Engagement at Catalyst. It's a not-for-profit think tank focused on inclusion and workforce development. I'd like to say thank you to the conference organizers, especially Professor Akka, for having me. And I also want to say my apologies for not being with you today as I recover from COVID. So wishing all of you great health and connection as well. So first, I'll offer a few brief remarks, and then I'll offer an overview of the Far and Widening the Rise of Polarization in Canada project that I built, led, and scaled on behalf of the Public Policy Forum, and which was released in late 2023. I'll also note that one of PPF's key pillars is an ongoing and permanent commitment to a healthy democracy. This polarization study marked year 3 of a multi-year investment that previously focused on the reduction of online harms, as well as how governments and the public can motivate transparency and accountability measures to minimize the harm of online platforms, including mis and disinformation, online hate, and abuses of privacy. So what I'll start by saying is that Canada has an interesting story, as we know, to tell about rapid polarization. One that for many Canadians became more palpable in 2020 with the advent of the pandemic, which has now evolved into where we find ourselves today. There was a perfect storm, so to speak. Rising affordability pressures created a narrative of resource scarcity, mass immigration, which of course is needed, but occurred without the infrastructure to fully support it, amidst also narratives that manipulated it, and amplified an overall sense of scarcity and precarity, while political actors across party lines leveraged identity politics, a space we once thought was mostly an American phenomenon. Layered on top of this was a growing sense of detachment between elites and everyday citizens. Many in the media, political, and intellectual classes believed that the rising tides of populism and disinformation would not happen in the same way here as our neighbors. Canada thought itself to be insulated, but as we know, it's not. And what we also know is what really accelerated polarization was the pandemic, something that people don't really want to speak about today, but I'm proud for the courage and, facing reality that we're all doing together at this conference. So what we know is that a medical crisis quickly became a social and political one. COVID-19 became a proxy for belief systems, where people were either believers or non-believers or somewhere in between. We either accepted the sacrifices, the loss of freedom of movement, isolation from family, the choice to put something in your body as right and moral decisions, or many labeled those who did not believe as fringe and even dangerous. Many were online and exposed to rampant disinformation, or you were at the front line and exposed to the sharper edges of the pandemic. Because COVID demanded collective action, Canadians participated in pressuring peers that were non-believers. And even though it was rightly a matter of public health, sometimes these non-believers were mocked, excluded, or sometimes threatened as well. And in hindsight, this was a fatal error. Many progressives believed they were standing on the right side of history, but in doing so, many Canadians were pushed out of the mainstream and felt that they'd become alienated. And when people are alienated and rejected, they become more vulnerable to radicalization, conspiracy, and grievance. Because when pain arrives, humans instinctively fear linear narratives to explain it, though nothing is often that simple. But more than clarity, they crave belonging, and bad actors exploit that, as I think Evan so rightly explained. As John Stuart Mill said, the worth of a state in the long run is the worth of the individuals composing it. So when we ignore or demean individuals, we erode our democratic strength, and this has been happening in Canada. Soon we watched populism and anger sweep the nation. For a time, it looked like there was a mass reversal of liberalism and a fait accompli. We were seeing a widening gap between the left and the right, the haves and the have-nots, across genders, and a broader relegation of cancel culture, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other progressive social developments of recent years. Wedge issues have abounded, amplified by echo chambers of social media and disinformation. And as we've recently seen, Donald Trump was reelected and began dismantling power structures as we know them. Suddenly, Canada was united around a common threat. And here we are today. We've seen a change in government and the highest voter turnout with it in 33 years. We have a renewed focus on building our domestic capacity and amid and against the US trade war, and we're more united in many ways than we've been in years. But we must not forget how quickly that polarization took root in these past 5 years, and how those fault lines still run through us. If we're not careful, they will absolutely continue to be exploited again and again. I think what this means is that for those who are more educated or part of the dominant class, we have to work not to alienate. We have to lead with empathy, humility, meet in conversation, because that's where people learn, exchange, and influence. History shows us that great social movements are advanced not through shame and blame, but through dialogue and the soft hand of persuasion and influence. And I do have to draw a line between those who are feeling forgotten, overlooked, and isolated, and then those who are bad actors. That is a different story, as we know. It's not about wagging a finger, but really extending an open hand that makes space for lasting change. And of course, that open hand must be extended to everyone in this great nation, especially diaspora communities in Canada, so that they too can engage and be meaningfully engaged in this elbows up moment. All of us, regardless of ideology, class, conviction, we have to work to rebuild trust across this country. Addressing the crisis of trust, of course, is easier said than done. And we've seen with the 2025 Edelman Trust Barometer is actually called the Trust and the Crisis of Grievance this year. And it reveals a profound shift to the acceptance of aggressive action, with political polarization and deepening fears, giving rise to the widespread sense of grievance. The Edelman Trust Barometer also shares that grievance imposes a trust penalty. So those with a high sense of grievance distrust all four institutions: business, government, media, and NGOs. And this chasm is affecting our performance, our productivity, our mental health, and we must collectively address it. And one of the most staggering but sadly unsurprising data points is a 10-point rise in the fear of discrimination amidst a rising climate of anti-immigration sentiment. What I will say is that Abacus data offers some compelling data alongside Edelman's, that the majority of Canadians still believe in the work of inclusion and the positive economic and social benefits. And I think there's serious opportunity around the positive engagement of young men as well. Their data actually shows that young men under 45 actually feel lost and forgotten and aren't anti-DEI. That actually tends to happen amongst older men, 45 plus, and are not really holding those negative views of inclusion in Canada. I guess the big question is, how do we get there? This begins by speaking to those who are not like us with respect, as I know everyone in this room does, but this has to be a broader project cascaded throughout our country. Every exchange has to reweave the social fabric, reaffirm our shared humanity, and restore civic trust. Because polarization is not natural to us. We are at our core social, empathetic, and capable of self-restraint, precisely so that we can live in common society. I think this is the unique gift of our humanity, that we need to reestablish that allyship, and each generation, as Amira so rightly shared, will have to fight to maintain it. So I offer these initial remarks after having built and led a systemic review on Canadian polarization with the Public Policy Forum. I'd like to give a bit of an overview of how it worked and what we learned. And what we really attempted was a system-wide diagnostic on the problem. So we commissioned 8 research papers from leading academics across the nation in partnership with McGill Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy. We worked with 6 community organizations and specifically built trust with the leaders of those organizations over time to build roundtables to bring 125 young people aged 18 to 35 across the country in person to have conversations around what was most difficult and challenging and polarizing in their lives. This included a really intersectional group of Canadians from both urban and rural places, which included NEET youth, students, frontline workers, newcomers, Indigenous communities, among others, with the intention to engage those who were at very different stages of civic engagement, from having not been civically engaged at all to community leaders themselves. We complemented that with innovative tech to survey 1,500 young adults across 321 locations, and some communities as small as 11 people, to expand those learnings from the roundtables. We had a very diverse and national steering advisory, and then we engaged Justin Ling, an investigative journalist and a leading voice, to report on the project. He then conducted additional interviews with politicians, political staffers, strategists, journalists, experts, activists, and regular citizens. We placed a particular focus on young adults because research shows that they're less inspired by our democracy than older generations, which we all know is extremely concerning because they will shape and steward our democratic futures. One note I'll share is the measure we use to actually determine whether Canada was polarized, and this really came from the Global Initiative on Polarization, which had 4 different indicators. The first being the centrifugal hallmark, which means that polarization involves a move away from the center and towards identifiable poles or extremities, which we found to be met. Second, the next measure identified a scale or mass form of conflict or dispute as being a necessary component of polarization, which we obviously saw with the truckers' convoy. So this criteria was also met. Third, countries experiencing internal polarization also tend to have public discourse that devolves into, quote, the terrain of identity in which the who matters more than the what and emotion more than reason. We also found this to be met. And finally, the initiative identifies a loss of viewpoint diversity and a default to simplification, binaries, in-group romanticization, and out-group demonization, which is also at play here in Canada. So this test allowed us to validate our instincts that yes, Canada is indeed polarized. And now on to a brief report summary. So the report really focused on the manifestation of polarization in 3 parts. The first was partisan sorting. This is a concept we explored further as a result of Dr. Eric Merkley's essay from the overall research series, which explains that we're seeing less diversity of opinion within political parties and more consistency on political issues, but strictly along partisan lines. As Merkley says, policy beliefs are becoming modestly more correlated with one another and much more correlated with partisanship. Then we look at political behavior with a focus on the theater and performance of politics, the burden of constant fundraising, and with that, the perception of the need for politicians to pander to their base, all which stoke polarization. One sitting politician actually told us that he fears his base and manages that through this kind of theater that we're talking about. And we see this being shared openly by politicians as well. As Aaron O'Toole shared, performance politics is fueling polarization, virtue signaling is replacing discussion, and far too often we're using this chamber to generate clips, not to start national debates. And with this focus on performance, young adults reported that they were choosing to tune out because their concerns were simply not being addressed, and that this political behavior was a hindrance to confronting the issues that matter. So what were the issues that matter most when they felt, what were the issues that mattered most to young people and that they felt were most polarizing? I actually have a slide here that I'd like to show, if you can just give me a moment, and I can talk you through some of it. Bear with me. Thank you. Is everyone able to see my slide? Okay, it says I'm screen sharing, so I'll keep going. So these were the issues that were the most divisive themes amongst young people. So what we can see here, especially in the timing of the report, was COVID, politics and the role of government, gender and sexual identity, human rights, equity and access issues, ethnicity, race and racism, economy, finance and resource allocation, religion, class and socioeconomic status, climate change, misinformation, generational divides, the land back movement, and mental health. I think that these are the things that plague, our nation in general, and we are really proud of the young people who shared their takes so that we could understand what was affecting them the most. The next part of the report really looked at online polarization, which explored the exploration of the decline of traditional and especially local media, and looked at social media and online platforms as well. We're well aware of the rampant mis and disinformation online, but we were able to uncover in the youth roundtables was quite eye-opening. In short, young people, as we know, are feeling immense pressure online. Both progressive and conservative youth and those, in between are especially disturbed about what they perceive to be the disciplinary nature of cancel culture. They shared that they feel that they have no space to test out ideas, form opinions, and quite frankly, make mistakes. One racialized youth even likened cancel culture to their feelings of the carceral system and explained from his perspective that it was only disciplinary with no grace or opportunity to evolve. There's so much more here in terms of the youth voices and what they shared. Another young Black woman spoke about her distress during the Black Lives Matter movement and of being called out online for not yet having posted. She shared that she needed time to grieve what was happening to her community before publicly engaging in the conversation and just wasn't given the time and space she needed. The issues young people felt were most polarizing around social media were the following, and I'll just share my screen again, if you can bear with me. Thank you. And of course, these are all available in the report that we put together. So really impacts on social cohesion, difficulty building trust, exacerbated by social media algorithms, willingness to engage on some topics and not others, intersectional identities, so frustrations about performance activism, lack of general understanding of nuance, and negotiation of safety and emotional labor when facing conversations about polarizing topics. They also talked about free speech, social media and its echo chambers and feeling trapped, lack of access to third spaces in the pandemic, but we also see the closure of third spaces more and more, and especially accessible ones when it comes to financial concerns and transportation. Cancel culture, social pressure to form strong opinions, and a variety of others. This brings me to our next set of findings, that we are indeed polarized, but perhaps not in the ways that we thought we were. Some telling data from our survey includes, which as I mentioned, includes 1,500 young Canadian voices, that 37% of respondents only moderately understand the left-right scale in relation to political beliefs. This was something that surprised me, that young people are also not engaging in politics and positive community building because we aren't actually using language that really identifies how they feel about the political spectrum, and that all of this really distracts from meaningful engagement. The next data point is that 44% of young adults believe the political stability of Canada is threatened moderately by the political division of its people, and nearly 40% of young adults shared that they believe political division will increase. They also reported not feeling meaningfully engaged in discourse in both political and policy discussions, because of course they are not. And only 50% believe that voting is a pathway to enacting change, which is alarming, but unsurprising given lower and lower turnout during recent elections, with the obvious exception of the recent federal election, which was, just after one of the lowest voter turnouts in the Ontario elections. So these persistent civic conclusions have led to disenchantment and disengagement amongst Canada's young peoples. They don't view engaging in mainstream democratic channels as an effective pathway to change. There's a conscious disengagement, which is often perceived as apathy, but it is not. Finally, and unsurprisingly, our report looked at the impact of the pandemic when it came to polarization as well. So as I mentioned before, it really looked at that tension between the trusting and the skeptical, between everyday people and who they perceive to be elites. And the challenge of evidence and facts becoming polarizing as well. We also asked Canadians what their deepest fears were about the future, and that'll be the last slide that I share. Please bear with me for a moment. Okay, so as you can see here, deepest fears include growing political and ideological polarization, acute decline of our democratic and public institutions, a dark and diminished economy for the next generation of Canadians, serious unrest due to growing inequality, a severe climate emergency, unmanageable costs of caring for Canada's aging population, the relative decline of Western societies compared to foreign powers, a privacy crisis and pervasive government surveillance, and of course, a catastrophic health crisis such as a major pandemic. All at which, are being felt. So where does this leave us now as I make my final comments? Public Policy Forum's next efforts will be concentrated on policy recommendations for how to advocate for a more functional form of politics, and we are really in the right moment to do it. We will also be looking at how to build healthier, more positive and connected communities. Ones where young people and people in general are more empowered in Canadian democracy, where there's more diversity of opinion, where we actually have the more complex conflict negotiation tools to be able to engage in healthy debate and really have a focus on the issues that matter most. How can we really move from a culture of polarization to one that has a healthier amount of tension? So I'll leave it there and happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well, Victoria, and to Evan for these insightful discussions and inputs. Again, while I'm monitoring my forum to see if we have any questions online, I'm happy to pass the mic around the room for those of you who may not have had the chance to type your question yet. And if not, like I said, we're going to take a lunch break in a few minutes. In the meantime, I think Dr. Akça has a few comments about the conference as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Victoria and Evan, for your enlightening speech on roots of polarization. And I would like to take the moment to maybe think about the current situation of our conference. So far, we have had really great speeches on different dimensions of hate. The keynote speeches set the tone on what hate and polarization is, but we understood that the problem is not very simple to define in just legal means, especially by listening the three speeches in the first panel on the blurring line between hate speech and freedom of expression. Then in this panel with Evans and Victoria's presentations, we understood that there are many dimensions of hate. Like there are many themes that divides us. Public policy forums report was really great to understand those different themes, and Evans' efforts, like the anti-hate networks efforts, helped us understand specific dimensions, specific theme, which is far-right extremism. And I would like to share what the afternoon sessions, how the afternoon sessions will look like, and tomorrow's sessions will look like. These remaining sessions will help us to better understand the broad framework, the comprehensive framework of hate and polarization. For example, the first session, we kept speaking about the online aspect, like the internet, how social media is used. The first session in the afternoon will help us to better understand with great speakers from really important stakeholders of this topic. And the last session will focus on the impacts on the victims, individual and communities. There are really important presentations there. Tomorrow, we will listen to the representatives of victim communities, such as Tigray community, Hazara community, Yazidi community, and other communities. We will listen to them, and we have a really important keynote address from UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. And we also have one panel in the morning tomorrow, which is responses to hate crimes and hate speech, we have a prosecutor and 2 police officers representing different organizations. They will share how these institutions respond to hate crimes and hate speech. And as I said, there's going to be 2 more panels which will be dedicated to better understanding the experiences of victim communities in tomorrow's sessions. So thank you so much for your patience so far. And I believe Tarek has an announcement before we go to the break.
We'll go ahead and start the introduction of our 3rd panel for today, which is going to be about online hate and freedom of expression on social media. We're going to have 3 speakers for this panel, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce them one at a time. We'll just like the second panel, have a little more than an hour for the panel itself, giving about 20 minutes to each speaker, followed by our Q&A session, for which I think we're going to display the QR code in a few minutes. Right, Dr. Akça? Yeah? Okay, amazing. Cool. So I'll start with Anais Bussieres McNicol, and I apologize if I messed up the name. Anais is the Director of Fundamental Freedoms Program and Interim Director of the Privacy, Technology and Surveillance Program at CCLA. Since joining CCLA, Anais has fought in various forms for the respect of fundamental rights and freedoms. In parliamentary committees, she has criticized federal and provincial bills that infringed on freedom of expression and freedom of association. She also speaks regularly in the media, including to defend people's right to use their civic space to protest peacefully. Before joining the CCLA, Anais was a partner in a national law firm where she practiced litigation with a focus on public and constitutional law as well as civil law. She was particularly sought after to contribute to complex cases at the appellate stage, particularly before the Supreme Court of Canada. Anais was called to the Quebec bar in 2015 after completing her law degree at the University of Montreal. She then completed a 2-year clerkship at the Quebec Court of Appeal. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Anais. Moving on to our second speaker for today, Mr. Rizwan Mohammed. Rizwan Mohammed is a civic engagement professional with over 15 years of experience leading national initiatives to mobilize youth and community leaders to creatively participate in service learning and active citizenship. As a senior advocacy officer with the National Council of Canadian Muslims, the NCCM, Mohammed develops policy and engages in government relations to defend human rights and fundamental freedoms. Rizwan Mohammed graduated from the University of Toronto with a major in Islamic studies. Before joining the NCCM, he conducted research on Islamic thought and Muslim life, trained Muslim Student Association leaders, and served a wide range of Muslim-led community organizations all across Canada. Please welcome. Thanks for joining us. Now, last but not least, Aislinn, right? Aislinn, my apologies. Aislinn Jackson. Aislinn, they joined the BC Civil Liberties Association as Staff Policy Counsel in July 2023. Aislinn attended law school at the University of Toronto, where she was the co-editor-in-chief of the Indigenous Law Journal and the student caseworker in the Family Law and Residential Tenancy departments of the school's legal clinic. Aislinn started their legal career in the Treaty 7 area, representing First Nations in a variety of areas of law, including historical claims and child protection matters. They later practiced family and estates law in the Lower Mainland, serving legal aid clients and 2 LGBT plus families. Outside of law, she has a background in linguistics, Indigenous language documentation and revitalization, and computer science. Please welcome. So we can start in order of my introductions. You may either use the microphone on the table or you're more than welcome to use the podium as well, whichever is more comfortable.
So we've gotten together and come up with more of a panel discussion,
Perfect.
Collaborative presentation.
Amazing.
So I believe that Rizwan will be starting
the rise in online hate targeting marginalized communities with a focus on the experience of Muslim Canadians in recent years. I think we're at a place where we can no longer speak of online hate as if it exists only in the digital world. Its impacts are not hypothetical. Hate online is not separate from our ordinary experience of reality. It bleeds into our lives, our streets, our homes, and far too often it has spilled over into tragedy. The Muslim community in Canada knows this all too well. We've lived it, we're living it now. The 2017 Quebec City mosque shooting, the stabbing at the IMO mosque in Toronto, the horrific murder of the Afzal family in London. I'll say a little bit about how these attacks have been connected to online harms. So on January 29th, 2017, Alexandre Bissonnette opened fire at the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec City during evening prayers, killing 6 worshippers and injuring 19 others. Investigations revealed that Bissonnette had been radicalized through online platforms, frequently visiting Islamophobic websites and following far-right figures on social media. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 40 years. In 2020, on September 12th, Mohammed Aslam Zavis, a volunteer at the International Muslim Organization, or IMO Mosque in Toronto, was fatally stabbed while monitoring entry due to COVID-19 protocols. The assailant, William von Nurgem, had shared content from a satanic neo-Nazi group on social media. He was charged with first-degree murder. On June 6, 2021, Nathaniel Veltman deliberately drove his pickup truck into the Afzal family, a Muslim Pakistani Canadian family, killing 4 members and seriously injuring a 9-year-old boy. Veltman was influenced by white nationalist ideologies and consumed extremist content online, including manifestos from perpetrators of previous mass attacks, like Alexandre Bissonnette. He authored his own manifesto titled A White Awakening, expressing hatred towards Muslims and advocating for a violent revolution. In 2024, he was convicted of terrorism-related first-degree murder charges, the first of their kind in Canada, and sentenced to 5 life terms without parole for 25 years. Now, every one of these attacks was preceded by a toxic, unchecked environment online, one that normalized hatred, dehumanized Muslims, and emboldened people to act on that hate. So hate doesn't stay online. It metastasizes, it emboldens violence, fuels fear, and pushes people out of public life. Visibly Muslim women, those who wear hijab or the headscarf, are disproportionately targeted. And online hate leads to this real-world harassment, to job discrimination, for some to fear of even walking down the street. And what does that do? It erases. We hear from young Muslims who no longer feel safe being online. They delete social media apps, they self-censor, they disengage, not because they don't want to contribute to the conversation, but because the space has been made unsafe for them. And that's a form of erasure. It's not always violent, but it's profoundly harmful. And yet in the face of all of this, we also hear something else. We hear calls for more online safety, yes, but also something more. Canadian Muslims are calling for more digital justice. We're not asking for censorship. We have to protect free expression online, but what we are asking for is the freedom to participate fully, to speak, to share, to advocate without fear of violence being incited against us just for being who we are. And let's be clear, this isn't just about Canadian Muslims. As Ashlyn will speak to shortly, other diverse Canadians face relentless targeted harassment online that leads to real harms, real violence. What we've been finding out for too long is that the free marketplace of ideas we were promised online isn't free when some voices are drowned out by algorithmically amplified hate. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. Online freedom means nothing if it's a one-way street, and right now too many of our communities are being pushed off that street entirely. I'll turn it over to Ashlyn to maybe expand on some of these things.
Yeah, so lest we think that this is solely a problem about Islamophobia online, which I don't believe anyone in this room does, but it's helpful so we can see the contours of the phenomenon of hate more generally, to look at other examples that target other groups. In particular, I'm thinking of the 2018 Toronto van attack, which was motivated by extremely misogynist incel ideology. And the perpetrator was trying to launch a war, he told, an uprising of the incels against I won't repeat the incel terminology, but against what they perceive to be more socially privileged people who either gate-kept access to women or monopolized it, and women themselves. And he was influenced by other incel attacks, such as the Elliot Rodgers shooting in Southern California, and was actually personally in communication with Elliot Rodgers before that incident happened, and he took his own life. So this is that's an example where a form of hatred against women in particular has curdled online and led to this sort of radicalization and this sort of lethality. 10 people died in that attack. But there are also less fatal iterations. Just last month, a Hamilton man was sentenced to 7.5 months due to an incident where he had live streamed himself going on a bus and subjecting passengers on the bus to homophobic harassment, or transphobic particularly harassment, and ended up kicking a passenger in the leg several times and then uploaded the video to YouTube. As part of his defense in court, to the hate-motivated component, his lawyers advanced the argument that he didn't actually believe those things. He was just trying to get clicks and increase his profile and be a provocateur. And so while that incident didn't have the same sort of extreme effects on people's life that the other examples do, I think it really speaks to the culture online where this sort of behavior, these sort of provocations and harassment, this sort of overt demonstration of hate is incentivized. Do you have anything to add, Anais?
Well, I mean, I just want to echo this important backdrop and to say that we have to keep it in mind when we discuss the next point of our presentation, which is about the current state of Canadian law when it comes to online hate and online harms. And again, I'm cognizant of what has been said today, so I'll only give a very brief overview with a primary goal of countering some narratives that imply that online speech is totally unregulated in Canada, but I also want to recognize the shortcomings of existing protections. So first and foremost, the criminal code applies to speech online. In extreme cases might qualify as, for instance, uttering threats of bodily injury, hate propaganda, criminal harassment, or even intimidation. And we can also think of other criminal offenses, such as defamatory libel and publishing intimate images without consent that might be applicable. Also, human rights legislation can also be helpful because some provinces in a territory have included hate speech prohibitions in their human rights legislation. For instance, BC, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and their Northwest territories. On top of that, survivors have access to tort law or extra-contractual liability, they call it in Quebec. So they can sue cyberbullies for defamation and obtain an injunction so that the defamatory post is taken down, and they can also claim and obtain damages. It's also interesting to know that some provinces have statutes in place that target particular tactics online and give more convenient tools to survivors to fight back. So for instance, both BC and Quebec have some kind of Intimate Images Protection Act. So for instance, in Quebec, a victim or survivor can obtain an urgent court order requiring those who distribute, store, or host an intimate image shared without consent on a website to remove and destroy it immediately. And also in the school context, it's interesting to know that, for instance, in Ontario, students can be suspended or expelled for cyberbullying, even if the bullying took place outside of school. So again, a very brief overview with a key suggested takeaways. Online speech is subject to some regulation in Canada, but some of the legal protections already in place are imperfect. For instance, when it comes to criminal law, the reality is that enforcement depends on the police and the Crown, and I know that Ashlyn has some thoughts to share about this. Also, many of the protections that we just discussed place a heavy burden on the shoulders of the survivor. So the survivor is the one who has to make a complaint to the police or to an administrative tribunal. They're the one who has to file a lawsuit. And this comes with a cost. And when I say a cost, I think both of like the financial cost of legal proceedings, but also the human cost. We can easily think of how traumatic it is to experience online hate. Well, somebody who wants to pursue a legal action in the face of online hate has to relive that trauma, which can be very problematic and difficult. Also, we all know that these type of processes take a lot of time, so the victim or survivor won't see a solution before often many months or even years. Of course, and we'll get to the point where we can discuss this, one way to shift that burden away from the shoulders of the survivor is to ask social media operators to be more accountable when it comes to online abuse taking place on their platforms. But I also think that it's important to pause and ask ourselves essentially the million-dollar question, which is where should the line be? And in other words, can we and should we legislate our way out of this problem entirely? And then when I try to answer that question, which is a very difficult one, I always try to keep in mind how well-intentioned legislation can be used by the state to clamp down on speech that is absolutely vital in democracy. So speech that expresses dissent, unpopular views, or even offensive ideas. So I'm very curious to hear what my co-panelists have to say about this.
Yeah, so I want to add on that might seem like a bit of an opaque connection to draw when we're talking about hate, but it's not an unrelated phenomenon. The use of intimate images, including AI-generated deepfake intimate images, can really harass people and drive them out of public life. And a lot of what hate does and why freedom of expression is not just in opposition to efforts to counter hate is that hate makes it impossible or very, very difficult. It creates barriers to participation in public life and in the democratic process for people who are its targets. So the tactics that people use to target people that they don't believe deserve to participate in the democratic process as equals or at all, those are important to understand. And one of those tactics online is through non-consensual distribution of intimate images, including images that are generated by deepfakes. There has been some reporting, in particular from 404 Media, which is an independent investigative journalism outfit that covers technology and science. And they've written a really interesting profile earlier this year about a Chinese-American actor who had a stalker that was targeting her specifically by superimposing her face and features onto pornography and uploading that in volume to the internet along with her real name and nicknames that her close friends use for her. So that's the sort of tactic, and it was racially motivated as well. It was racially targeting her. So these systems interlock, and part of what we have to think about when we're thinking about the online effects of hate is not just how it allows these hateful ideologies to fester and spread, but also the way that the techniques that people have of pushing people out of public life that are unique to the internet, and that in many cases are very overwhelming because they can be machine assisted. and automated the way so many of our things are automated. So yeah, intimate images. And the reason I wanted to layer in on the BC Act in particular is because I think there's some really interesting techniques for how to try and lessen the burden on people who are victims of this particular tactic in there. So one of the things we have is we have a choice of forum. People can choose whether they want to go to a court that can award greater monetary damages or to the Civil Resolution Tribunal, which is BC's small claims court. And it empowers the Civil Resolution Tribunal to do takedown orders for intimate images. People are also allowed to go to the Civil Resolution Tribunal earlier for a takedown order and then pursue damages in court later, which that kind of bifurcation is very, very unique in the law. So there are some ways that we can think about empowering people who are the victims of these sort of tactics without actually, without sort of broad incursions into free expression. Another interesting feature is that it allows younger people who ordinarily would not be old enough to have standing to sue in their own right to go to the Civil Resolution Tribunal for the remedies that it's able to give directly. So I believe I didn't check this before the talk, but I believe it's 14-year-olds and up can go to the Civil Resolution Tribunal without having to necessarily go through their parents. And unfortunately, you heard I have a background in child protection, but it's not always the case that parents are sources of safety for their children, unfortunately. Sometimes parents are the most proximate source of threat. And that's particularly true of children who are sexual or gender minorities. So it's really interesting ideas of how we can better empower and support people rather than having the government have discretion on where and how they enforce the legislation we already have.
Maybe I can add a little bit more about our experience with Muslim victims or survivors as they navigate the current legal context with police and the courts, and then maybe will we talk after about the digital specific stuff? Okay, so I'll just add a little bit about the current situation that Muslims are experiencing, and perhaps many others that are coming from racialized backgrounds or targeted on the basis of their race or their identity. While we do have legal tools like hate propaganda and other things on the books that Anais referred to, we are finding that real-world impact of those tools has limitations for us. The bar for enforcement is incredibly high, and even when that threshold is met, we've found some police are uninterested or sometimes untrained even to take action. And so we see survivors are often left alone. We're told to save our screenshots of things. We're told to report to the platforms. We end up navigating a system that wasn't ever designed for us. So I think one of the things that some of the platforms did in the past few years was to encourage global digital citizenship type initiatives where they'd say, let's improve people's digital literacy. And if only people's digital literacy would improve, we'd become somehow more civil online. That's not been happening in our experience, despite our active participation in these efforts for years. We were offered opportunities to learn how to mount digital counter-speech campaigns to say, if people are having campaigns where they're doxing us or trying to get us arrested. For example, a common practice in a common phenomenon that you'll find is, if somebody has a problem with some Muslim advocacy, online, they'll frame it as terrorism or some other form of extremism. They'll often frame it as terrorism, and then they will send messages to the employers of these Muslims, telling them, do you know you employ terrorists? And when the Muslims kind of, who are subjected to this, try to go through the platforms, they try to go through the police or anything like this, they're often met with, very little support, very little guidance about how to actually navigate this whole system. So the counter speech, has not been helping. There's been, efforts to say, when white supremacists in some European countries were doxing some people, well, flip it around and dox them back and expose them. And it was like use people's weapons against each other, and then that was a better way to handle things. But unfortunately, that kind of thing has not been helping us. So we're at a point where we feel like there needs to be some kind of balanced, measured legislation that protects freedom of expression, but also creates new tools to address the online hate that we're experiencing. That's one perspective that we have on this.
Yeah, so I also, we wanted to address freedom of expression in particular online. We'll keep these comments brief because there's been quite a lot of very good and in-depth discussion of free expression in the Canadian law in relation to free expression this morning already. But online free expression has some particular importance and some particular challenges. So one of the things that when we look at whether infringements of free expression are demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society, we look at why free speech is important. The Supreme Court of Canada has told us that the purposes of our guarantee of free expression are to promote truth, political or social participation, and self-fulfillment. Now, of those, the middle one, that political or social participation, is load-bearing for our democracy, right? If people are pushed outside of the discussion, then they're not able to counter any sort of narratives at all that might be spread about groups that they belong to. They're not able to participate, and it lays the groundwork for the political conversation and the public life to move towards dehumanization and even violence towards that group. So that's why it's possible constitutionally for freedom of expression to be infringed in order to address hate. There's also a recognition from the Supreme Court in Whitecott that the presence of hate speech can be a serious barrier to the full participation in democracy of the targets of that hate speech. So the very value that underlies the importance of freedom of expression also militates in favor of cultivating the public sphere such that people aren't excluded on the basis of personal characteristics that can't be changed or can only be changed with great personal cost and potentially even a total shift in identity. So in that context, we need to be very, very cautious about looking to the law to solve the problem for us. And I'm not the first person today to make that kind of comment, especially the criminal law. There are such extreme consequences when it comes to criminal convictions. People's liberty gets taken away. People have to labor with stigma. We need to look at what interventions are going to impair free speech as little as possible, because the people who are administering these systems are not necessarily going to be informed by the same values as the people who try to design them, right? The people who make the tools are not necessarily going to be the ones wielding them. And there is no cause so just that its rhetoric cannot be used as a sword for oppression. We've touched on very briefly the way that sometimes rhetoric around bias can be used to try and silence. This happens with respect to the conversation around Palestine. It also, in perhaps a less fraught in Canada example, it happens around the conversation in relation to trans people, in particular trans women. And I'm going to elaborate that example a little bit, both because it's one we haven't really addressed today, but also because I think it illustrates the dynamic in a way that's a little bit less fraught for a Canadian audience, because the rhetoric that is so common in the UK, for example, has not really been taken up in Canada in quite the same way. But it's a rhetoric of the existence of trans people, and in particular trans women, being itself misogynist. This sort of idea of feminism or anti-misogyny being weaponized to try and exclude trans people from participation in sports or from being able to use public washrooms. That's something that is quite advanced in the UK at this point, to the point where trans women are now banned from participating even in amateur soccer in that country. And we see the rhetoric echoed in the United States as well. So we need to be very careful that, and even white supremacists, their rhetoric is about safety, right? Much of their rhetoric, whether or not we believe that that's sincere, or whether it's a front. Like the infamous 14 words draw on the idea that white people are in some way unsafe or will be unsafe in the future if white supremacists aren't allowed to develop their ideas and propagate them in society. So that's why it's important generally, and in the online context in particular. It's a tool that's so important for marginalized communities to be able to connect with each other, even across international boundaries. That presents a wrinkle for any sort of country trying to define what is acceptable free expression. What community do we make reference to when the conversation is global? There are very different standards around the world, and some of these are perspectives that are going to broaden us and make us a stronger and more inclusive society, but only if we're able to actually freely express it and not shut down each other with conclusions about what people's motivations may be behind their words. We have to be very, very careful about empowering the state to do that. Do you have anything to add?
Absolutely. I mean, just want to echo what has been said so eloquently by my two panelists, and maybe share a little bit of CCLA's perspective. Historically, CCLA has been quite opposed to legal prohibitions on hate speech, and CCLA's, and of course, we like that ship pretty much has sailed. The Supreme Court of Canada has decided that those prohibitions are constitutional, but the reality is that much of what CCLA's fears were about was the fact that what is hate and hateful speech can sometimes be very subjective, and we might together, and we won't do that, but take 4 examples of speech, and we would together try to decide whether this expression is really dehumanizing or vilifying an individual because they are a part of a specific community, or if it's quote-unquote only repugnant or offensive or humiliating speech, which the Supreme Court of Canada has said shouldn't be broadly prohibited in a free and democratic society. And I'm sure many of us would disagree on where the line should be. And that, so prohibiting and increasing prohibitions on speech in Canada would come at a cost, because giving to the state the power to clamp down on speech could very well be weaponized against specific minority groups or marginalized groups. And it was very interesting to hear what Rizwan had to say about this as well. And it's when I'm having discussions with members of parliament or members of provincial parliament about specific bills and their implications with respect to freedom of expression, I'm often being told, like, oh, you're a bit of an alarmist, this isn't the intent of the bill, this isn't what we're trying to do. And my answer always is, I don't doubt that. This is not about the legislator specific intent right now or your government specific intent right now, but this is also about what powers it gives to the state and the government of tomorrow to suppress speech. So while it is important to protect people who are living with the consequences of hate, especially including online, it's also important to remember that whatever tool, or as Ashlyn has said, sword, we can give to the state, it can very well come back, bite us very dangerously in the future.
Quick note to add here. I think I find my fellow panelists' arguments compelling. From a NCCM perspective, we're broadly sympathetic, and I think we share the concerns about what powers are given to the state to potentially suppress free expression. We are completely on the same page that freedom of expression is essential, especially for marginalized communities who have historically been silenced. I think where our perspective starts to perhaps get colored by our experiences here is that this freedom of expression that we all have a right to exercise that needs to be protected, it's much harder to practice that freedom of expression. It's much harder to speak freely when your physical safety is being threatened online and at every turn. And it's visceral for you. You're now starting to be followed around by the people that were stalking you online and so forth. So I think for us, one of the things that complicates this whole this work and trying to find solutions together is that online hate is silencing us too, not just potential government powers that overreach. So that online hate is silencing us through intimidation, through harassment, even algorithmic exclusion. So we agree we must protect speech, but I think we can't mistake unmoderated toxicity for freedom. And so this is something that makes it very difficult for us to figure out how do we move forward.
I think that leads us very nicely into our next topic of discussion, which is a bit of a deeper dive into the digital dimension specifically.
Yeah, I think maybe I can pick up from there to sort of expand a little bit about what I'm saying here about what's happening online with us. I think we were told for a long time by very optimistic technologists and others that we shouldn't be Luddites. We should be really excited about the new opportunities that are going to come from the online spaces, the democratization of knowledge, the building of community, all kinds of opportunities would be there. And I think we do see many benefits and we see many opportunities. But we're also seeing that this idea that social media platforms or the digital spaces are neutral spaces, that you can make them whatever you want to make them is not actually true. The platforms curate what we see and what gets amplified. So outrage, conflict, hate, that's what we're finding rises to the top because that's what the algorithms as they're currently designed seem to reward. This is the business model of many digital platforms. And so for Muslim communities specifically, I think this is devastating consequences. We're now seeing deepfakes and disinformation targeting imams and community leaders, videos misrepresenting sermons where they seem to be saying anti-Semitic things or anti-LGBTQ things, or other kinds of things that reinforce prejudice and bias. We're seeing AI-generated fabrications linking Muslims to crimes, all designed to stoke fear and justify discrimination, to say, look at these Muslim refugees come in and ruin our country and they break our laws and they don't respect our values. Like, some of this content is actually coming from, generated by AI. The content moderation systems that are supposed to protect us, increasingly, they're opaque. They're often automated and frequently biased. I'm going to leave it to some of my colleagues to talk about a little bit more about automation and pros and cons of that. But legitimate Muslim speech, whether it's about religion, justice, Palestine, is disproportionately flagged and taken down. We're seeing this with many platforms. I think TikTok was doing less takedown of Muslim advocacy around Palestine, but then you saw in the United States attempts to ban it, maybe for multiple reasons, but this certainly was part of the story. We see that hate-filled content can remain online for days, weeks, or never be removed at all, no matter how much we go through the standard channels to report, no matter how much we work with the trust and safety departments of the different platforms who try to create so-called trusted flagger programs. Like, a lot of that stuff is not really transparent, well-constructed. Sometimes it's based on relationships, like who you're tight with, who can help you. This is absolutely unacceptable. So I think, when we're seeing content that is algorithmically amplified, that's hate-filled, and it's drawing more clicks, Ashlyn referred earlier to the Hamilton case of this defense in court. That sounds absurd, but it's not absolutely absurd in every respect. There are people that are putting things out there to get clicks and likes, and that gets monetized. So this is not a coincidence. It is a kind of approach to a business model. If I were to be a bit more charitable and not say that it's completely profit-driven, we could say that there's a design flaw here that needs to be fixed. Platforms that can target ads down to our zip code should also be able to target moderation tools to protect vulnerable communities. So we need transparency, we need accountability. We think that it might be helpful to have algorithmic audits, public oversight, not vague commitments from platforms on their trust and safety pages of their web pages, but actually enforceable standards that center safety and fairness without sacrificing our commitments to free expression. I'll invite my colleagues to say more.
So one of the things that's very challenging about regulating online platforms is that most of them are not based in Canada, and we are not a very large market comparatively, right? So many times these are American companies that are steeped in and primarily responsive to the American legal system with their norms around free expression and other issues. They're also responsive, for example, with the EU when they came out with GDPR. The whole tech industry, all of Silicon Valley, scrambled to implement it and make sure that they were compliant, at least with respect to the users located in Europe. But the EU is, again, a much larger market than Canada. So when there's a risk for Canadian legislatures when trying to regulate these actors that are largely located outside of our jurisdiction, that they might choose to just stop serving Canadians entirely. This risk is sometimes referred to as market exit. And that's something where perhaps we don't care if we don't get X.com in its current state, where it's flooded with the worst kinds of neo-Nazi rhetoric. But it does cut us off from that sort of global public sphere that has been that has developed and has been allowed to develop in private hands. So there's this sense, it feels like these should be public spaces. They function as a town hall, as a public square. When we go to these social media platforms, that's how we get, one of the ways that we figure out what people are thinking, what's going on outside of our own backyard, especially with the decline of traditional print news media. But it's not reliable because we do get sent into these algorithmic silos. It's still where we get our information from. And if we cut Canadians off from this, that I think will have implications that we need to think through. Right? So that's a very big risk. We could be cutting ourselves off from the world of discourse. We could cut people off potentially from keeping in touch with their families who might live outside of Canada. We would need to think about creating a domestic infrastructure to replace it. It's very, very, it's a can of worms, essentially, and maybe those are worms that we can kind of parse through and sort out, but maybe they're not, and it's very scary and intimidating for lawmakers and for policymakers to think about that, and to look at the example of the online news legislation and how Meta's just stopped allowing Canadian news media to be shared on their platforms. What implications does that have for disinformation? It's complex and there are lots of knock-on effects. How do we effectively enforce our policies if it isn't through buy-in from the corporations we want to govern themselves? This is not just an issue in the context of hate and moderation, but it's a broader issue, a governance issue over these resources that are in some sense beyond the jurisdiction of any particular state, but also embedded within a USA context that doesn't match up well often with the rest of the Anglophone world in particular. I'll speak to because I operate mainly through the English language. So it's that's something that I think in these discussions I always have it in the back of my head is, and I've sensed it when I've been talking to lawmakers through my work with BCCLA on digital policy. There's a real reluctance to overextend what they can reasonably do and potentially face backlash or even just not be effective, right? So the power that these institutions, these companies have, in comparison even with governments, it's extreme, and they're not democratically accountable in any way. So I'm just flagging that, I suppose, as being an issue whenever we're talking about the digital specific domain. But I think it's a large part of this issue is that a very United States approach to free expression in the marketplace of ideas. Well, they don't even say free expression because that's not how they frame it. But in a way that we can't really grapple with or push back on, those values have been sort of imposed on the world through these U.S.-based companies, governing themselves according to, the values in their jurisdictions of origin, and it's a real governance problem and it doesn't have a clear solution, but it's something that is always going to be in the background of these discussions when it comes to online harms and online platforms.
Absolutely, and with this context in mind, I think it's interesting to try to go down the path of what a policy response to online harms could look like, it could be. And the CCLA thinks that any policy response must put individuals first, be consistent with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and guard against the possibility that it would have chilling effects on online participation. And when I say that, I think both of an individual who would not be willing to engage online because of the consequences of their free protected speech being posted online, but also of the example that Rizwan was giving in terms of somebody no longer feeling like they have access to the online platforms because they've been pushed out from these platforms because of the presence of hate in there. An example of something that would be a clear deal breaker for us is state surveillance by proxy. So for instance, legislation that would mandate or allow proactive monitoring of content by social media platforms, except maybe for very specific cases of extremely harmful content. And that's because of course, privacy rights, but like freedom of expression, but also people's right to privacy. We do agree that there's a clear need for transparency to the public in how platforms' content moderation process would function. And we agree that right now this transparency is not present. And there's also, in our opinion, a need for a mechanism of appeal when speech is being taken down so that users can be empowered to report conduct that is problematic, but are also empowered to explain the circumstances, or at least have some kind of appellate mechanism. And yeah, the last point is that like legislation must encourage platforms to create tools that empowers users, giving them tools to quickly and easily block those they consider bad actors and lock down their own accounts.
Yeah, the same kind of quasi-public character of these large social media platforms that makes it important to mitigate the hate that will exclude people from that sphere of conversation and push them out of the democratic process in that way. It I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Goodness, but it is. Right. Okay. Yes. I was. My point was that it's double-edged, right? Because when we create, as a government, when the government creates incentives for those platforms to infringe on users' free expression, users don't actually have the same legal rights against these private corporations that they would against the government, right? And and again, these platforms are not democratically accountable. So if they have politics, including far-right politics, and then they use these tools that are called for or even required by legislation in order to further marginalize and exclude the already marginalized people, and that can be a very large problem. And we have to look at not just the intent behind pieces of legislation, but what use they could be put to if people with opposite goals can lay their hands on the controls. Yeah, so we're also very concerned about procedural rights for people who are for the actual content promoters or the content creators. There have been proposals where it's the only people who have any right to challenge a government takedown, for example, would be people who the actual the website that's hosting it, rather than the user whose expression it actually is. Of course, the website, if they're a content hosting service, for example, or a social media service, they're not in the best position to defend that expression, even if it does have artistic merit. For example, artistic merit is something that comes up often in the context of intimate images and pornography and in the age assurance discussion, for example. But the people who are best positioned to actually defend their expression are the people whose expression it is.
The fourth and last panel for today. This is going to be another hybrid panel for us due to one of our speakers not being able to make it last minute. So we will have him live on Zoom right up there, and I'm going to introduce him in a minute. And two in-person speakers here, both of whom I will introduce shortly. So this fourth and last panel for today is primarily going to be on about impacts on victims and communities. So we're going to look at the broader theme from the perspective of some of the victim communities. Our first speaker, who's here on the stage with me, is Mariam Musa. Mariam Musa is a policy analyst and researcher at the Office of the Federal Ombudsperson for Victims of Crime. She led and contributed to several key initiatives aimed at supporting and empowering victims and survivors of crime, including the OVC's special report, Strengthening Access to Justice for Victims of Hate Crime in Canada. With a strong commitment to social justice, Mariam's work focuses on strengthening victims' rights, addressing systemic inequities, and improving access to justice for victims of crime. She's also worked on community-based initiatives supporting victims of hate-motivated violence, fostering partnerships with community organizations and law enforcement to enhance reporting mechanisms and victim services. Thanks for joining us, Mariam. Now, secondly, we have Dr. Ronan Lee, who's joining us live up there from Zoom. Dr. Ronan Lee is a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow at Loughborough University, London, where his work focuses on Asian politics, the Rohingya, Myanmar, genocide, hate speech, and migration. Dr. Lee is an award-winning scholar, author, and an expert on Myanmar and Southeast Asian politics, with a distinguished background spanning academia, politics, and media. His acclaimed book, Myanmar's Rohingya Genocide, Identity, History, and Hate Speech, earned him the 2021 Early Career Emerging Scholar Prize from the International Association of Genocide Scholars. A former Queensland State MP and a parliamentary secretary, he brings extensive experience in public policy and political strategy. Ronan's academic work, including a PhD from Deakin University based on field research with Rohingya communities in Myanmar and Bangladesh, has been widely recognized. He lectures internationally on the weaponization of history and culture in Myanmar, including at MIT's Seminar 21, and has held visiting positions at Queen Mary University of London. A respected media commentator, Ronan.
Dr. Dawood, for the invitation, and thank you all for still being here at 3 p.m. on a Friday. So I hope that it's engaging, and I appreciate all the commentary and everything that we've learned so far during the day, and even the intersections, even just speaking about intimate images, which we don't necessarily think relating to hate crime and online, but it's very, very interesting and relevant. So I'll just start off with a brief introduction into where I'm coming from and my position here and stance. If I can click around. Okay.
Oh, there you go. It works now.
Oh, okay, awesome. Okay, great. So we're good, guys. So yeah, my name is Miriam, and I work at the Office of the Federal Ombudsperson for Victims of Crime. We are independent. We work at arm's length, but we're housed under the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice Canada. So the office really works to promote access to federal victim services. We review complaints from victims and survivors of crime across Canada. And we also really try to ensure to make it so that policymakers, government officials, those working with the public, understand the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights, and then the systemic issues that impact victims and survivors across Canada. And also the Ombudsperson also works as a special advisor to the Minister of Justice. If we go to the next slide, here you go. So this is just a little diagram of how we can help. So we offer information, we receive calls, emails, directly from victims and survivors every single day that will look to gain information about whether it be their rights as victims, whether it be services that are available, or whether it be to provide input or thoughts on the way that the laws work and how they impact victims and survivors. And then through all of those communications, we identify systemic issues. And we sometimes make reports on that, and that's where this hate crime report research that I worked on stems from. But before I go into the findings of the report and speak about that, I just want to speak about a little bit about the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights. So just a show of hands here, who has heard about the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights? Okay, wow. More people than I expected. Usually, there's only a few hands, and some of them are my colleagues. So, so I'm happy to see that. So for those that are familiar or not familiar, the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights was introduced 10 years ago. It's its 10-year anniversary this year. And it created legal rights for victims of crime for the first time in Canadian history. It provided the right to information, the right to protection, the right to participation, the right to restitution, and also the right to file a complaint when these rights have not been respected and upheld. So it's really a foundational piece of framework that can be used as a lens when we look at approaching hate crimes, specifically in this case here. So I'll try to remember, and we'll try to use that lens when we're thinking about the criminal justice system's response and addressing hate crimes through this lens of victims' rights. So here, if you can see, there is a bit of a continuum here that we look at how the victims' rights can be applied throughout the criminal justice systems, the different phases, I would say. And when it comes to victims of hate-motivated violence, we can see here it really applies at the investigation phase. So we look at the right to information. So victims have the right to information about the status and outcome of the investigation of the alleged offense, the location of the proceedings if it's going to court, and any available services to them. Victims have the right to protection, and that's by having their views, their security and privacy considered during the investigation, and also when making bail orders. And then also victims have the right to participation. So by conveying their views when decisions are made by authorities and affect their rights under the act and have those views considered. So what does that look like for victims of hate crime? Specifically when we think about, we spoke earlier about the Afzal family and the killing that took place in London, Ontario. And part of the research project that we did, I attended the sentencing hearings, and I heard and sat through and listened to the community impact statements, victim impact statements. The right to present a victim impact statement or a victim impact statement is legislated through the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights. And then the right to remedy and restitution. But oftentimes we hear that victims of hate crime specifically, if they do choose to report, they're not always kept informed of what is the outcome, what happens after I reported, right? Did the person get caught? Did they not get caught? Even if there really is no answer or there is no update, providing that update is still an update and is still information. When it comes to participation, I already spoke about the right to provide a victim impact statement or community impact statement. And we know that that's really important for victims of hate and those that are experiencing hate, because we know that hate crimes impact the community at large. And that's really a great way and a great tool that the community can use to show that this has a larger impact in that sense. So now I'll go into speaking about the report and the study that we did. And I worked on it with my colleague, Aisling McCoy, that's right there. And let me just scan that here. So we want to look at why now? Like, why did we look into this report? Why did we decide to study the impacts of hate and access to justice? Of course, a big part of it plays into the increasing numbers of police-reported hate crimes and the statistics that are there. But as well as that, there's an expectation that the criminal justice system is bound to fail victims of hate. There's a normalization of failure that it's normal to expect that if you report, nothing will happen. Or if you report and charges are laid, well, the chances of conviction are very low, or that sentencing is low, or there's not enough evidence. There's just this normalization of this, and we want to look at ways in which access to justice can be strengthened. So keeping in mind that our office, we're at the federal level, so we kept that lens when we did our research and we did our surveys and whatnot. And when I speak about surveys, we conducted a survey, 2 separate surveys, one to police and one to victim services across Canada. We heard from 187 respondents, and if we look at here, if we look at the findings that we found, so just a bit of context as well. At the time of when we were conducting the study, Bill C-63, which you have heard about, was introduced by the government. So we used the survey as a tool as well to hear feedback from police and from victim services on those measures that were there, specifically on creating a specific hate crime offense, and then there were some measures around peace bonds, specific peace bonds, and yeah, those were the 2 main ones that we spoke about. So we want to see, like, how effective did you think this would be? How much easier would this make your job? Is it that we need new legislation? What is the deal here? So from just like general surveys and what we've heard from police, is that 72% of police officers said that they did not have a dedicated hate crime unit. And of those that did, 44% had only 1 officer, but most units were established after 2020. And this is not that alarming because we need to keep in mind that some police units are a lot smaller. So to have a whole dedicated hate crime unit when it might not be as big of an issue in that area, might not be necessary. But overall, what we did here, which I'll go into a bit later, is the need for training on identifying hate crimes, labeling them, and also sometimes on criminal code definitions and how do you even define that. When it came to surveying victim services, we saw that 44% of victim services had fewer than 5 paid staff, and most of them rely on volunteers to manage their services. 73% of victim services cited limited resources as a significant barrier to providing adequate support for victims of hate crime. And police officers estimated that only 35% of hate crime victims that report to police will access support services. Some police services, like I know Ottawa Police, when you're filling out your incident report, there is a checkbox that's there saying, do you want to have a referral to victim services? That is of those that report, once again. And so that 35% ties into keeping that in mind of that referral service. And then if we look at some of the challenges that were identified by victim services in supporting victims of hate crime, the biggest one being victims' awareness of services available. So if we think back to previously when I spoke about the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights and how you have the right to information, including the right to the information about services available. Well, that right to information, if you look at the actual legislation, is only available upon request. So you need to know to ask for it to be able to access all of the other rights that exist in the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights, which is a big issue. But we can expect victims and survivors of crime to have an awareness of victim services that are available if they're not interacting with criminal justice actors. That's mainly when you're getting those referrals. So if you're not reporting to police, or if you're not reporting to security, or maybe school campuses, or healthcare professionals, that is usually when you're getting those referrals to these services. So that was the number one challenge that was identified. The next one was specialized training. So having specialized training on how to work and best support victims of hate. And outside of my role here at the office, I worked on a small project with Ottawa Victim Services, an anti-racism, anti-hate project. And we looked to see how we could increase the number of victims who are accessing supports and who are accessing victim services at OVS that were victims of hate, because the numbers were not adding up. You had high numbers of police-reported hate crimes in Ottawa, but then when we looked at victims of hate that were accessing supports, I think it was below 2% of overall victims that access the supports. So I was engaging with different community-based agencies in Ottawa, informing them of Ottawa Victim Services, that you have access to counseling, graffiti removal, safety planning, all of these things. And then also working with the staff as well to see when they're inputting their data in their case management system, how are they tracking this and how are they identifying if it is a hate crime. And it's not only there, but just in general, and this data kind of supports that, is that there is a lack of specialized training on how to identify it, or what are questions that you can ask. If somebody's calling and saying that they were assaulted, well, what was the motivation behind that assault? What was their motivation? So another one was culturally relevant support, and then victim compensation program eligibility, and that's a big one because in some victim compensation programs across the country that are provided by the provinces, in order to be eligible to access those services, it needs to be a criminal code offense. And then when we look at what is a hate crime, well, we heard from the speakers earlier today that there is no specific hate crime offense in the criminal code. There's public incitement of hatred, there's willful promotion of anti-Semitism and whatnot, but there's no hate crime offense. So sometimes that is a barrier to accessing those services. And then other challenges is outreach to groups most targeted by hate. And when we think of the previous slide, when we spoke about the lack of resources for victim services agency and how most of them had fewer than 5 paid staff and they're relying on volunteers, well, it doesn't leave much room to be doing outreach, right? When you are dealing with high caseloads and high case management and safety planning, and you have backlogs and all these things, there's not much time for outreach. So they rely sometimes on grants and contributions to fund specific projects, which was the project that I worked on with Ottawa Victim Service was funded by a grant by the province. But those are time limited, they're not long lasting, and it's only really a start to creating that change and doing that outreach. And then translation and interpretation services was another barrier or challenge that was identified. When it comes to challenges that were identified by police, a biggest one was that victims are not reporting to police. Why are they not reporting? It's well noted, well documented that there is distrust among some groups with police and with law enforcement. And then as well as if we look back at that normalization of failure, well, if you see that in your community or in the news or anecdotally that the few people that are reporting and you're hearing from those experiences and how they were treated or that there was no outcome, what is the likelihood of you wanting to go and report yourself? So having confidence in the police, that the police will take it seriously and that the police will address this as a serious issue and a serious crime, having that confidence is what will lead to more people reporting. And that confidence and that build of trust does not happen overnight, and it doesn't happen with a small grant that's there. The next one was difficulties in defining and prosecuting hate crimes, which I know that there was talks earlier on in the day about, would having an actual hate crime in the criminal code really change anything? Well, from what we've heard from police, and not having clear definitions, because currently there's no clear definition of hate crime in the criminal code, they rely on the Supreme Court of Canada's decisions, would help them be able to lay charges. And then when we go into the investigations are lengthy and can lack collaboration. Some police officers, respondents have stated that they were not getting collaboration with some of the community members or the people that were reporting to further to push the investigation forward, and resource constraints as well. When we look at high caseloads, and then for some of the services and agencies that don't have dedicated hate crime units, that seem to be challenging as well. There were quite a few other challenges that are reported in our report, but I just wanted to bring these ones forward. And if we're going to look ahead, so what's the next steps? What do we do from here? So there was a number of opportunities that were highlighted in the findings and in the survey responses from victim services and from police, and one of them being specialized training and legal expertise. So, officers clearly expressed the need for training on the legal distinctions between hate speech and protected expressions. So trying to navigate that. And when it comes to prosecutors and legal experts, they can rely on using case law and looking at case law and different examples. Police, some police service officers don't have that time, and they don't have that expertise, and it's also not their realm of expertise. That's when it comes to the Crown prosecutors, and so they wanted specialized training or increased collaboration with Crown prosecutors to work together. And to have regular and early consultations with Crown prosecutors to help inform the investigations, to ensure that they're documenting the evidence properly and that they're looking in the right places and whatnot. And then when it came down to hate crime units, so larger police services should consider the benefits of establishing a dedicated hate crime unit with officers that are trained in hate crime detection, response, and community engagement, and building on best practices of other agencies. So tomorrow there will be a panel with criminal justice professionals, like Ottawa Police will be there, and they're very well known for their hate crime unit. I'm pretty sure it was the first one that was established. So you'll hear more about that from them. And then legislation, so earlier Bill C-63 was there, and it did provide an avenue and an opportunity to look at having dedicated hate crime offense and some other measures. So we'll see with this new parliament that came in and that started, what will come out of that. I'm sure that there will be some sort of legislation that will be introduced, whether it be similar to the previous one, but it is an opportunity that's there. Another opportunity at the federal level is that there's the federal National Action Plan to Combat Hate, and that provided specifically funding. What caught my eye specifically was funding for victim services to provide specific supports for victims of hate. And why that caught my eye is because the providing victim services and the compensation of victim services is the responsibility of the provinces. But the federal government is open to going into a cost-sharing agreement, essentially, with provinces that are open to it, to fund dedicated supports for victims of hate. And as well, with the National Action Plan, there was the talks of developing a resource hub for victims of hate.
Maria, can you please wrap up?
Yeah, okay, got it. So, those are the opportunities. In our report, we make 13 recommendations. these are the ones that I wanted to highlight, really is to center the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights in Canada's action plan on combating hate. And in considering the response to victims of hate is to center the rights of victims of crime, create a standalone hate crime offense, to hold platforms accountable for online hate speech. And we speak a little bit about in the report about the algorithms, and then a national resource hub for victims of hate crime. So, bottom line, we need some strategic investment in from the report, specialized hate crime units, some support services, training, and that better respect for the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights. And that's it. So if you would like to learn more about the work that we do at our office, we also are always open to hearing from organizations that work or with victims of crime, to hear about best practices or how to address issues, or folks can also at the systemic level, if they have complaints about criminal code legislation, they can file that impact victims of crime. They can file those complaints with us, and that helps us when there's new legislation that comes forward or new proposals. We use that as data to help inform decision making and recommendations. So that's that. Thank you.
So next in line we have Dr. Lee joining from UK.
Okay, just before I share my screen, I'll just say a couple of quick things. Would have loved to have been able to join you, but circumstances out of my control sort of meant that was not possible. This is a 50% Canadian household, so would have absolutely been delighted to have been there with you, but unfortunately I'm not able to. I'm going to talk today about the impact of hate speech on the Rohingya community. Really what I want to get to is their contemporary situation and how that happened, but I want to start with a little bit of history. So I'll begin with a little bit of history just to position this community. I can't see who is there in the audience, so I'm not sure whether people know the community or don't know the community, or know the context. So I'll give a little bit of history just to get things started, and then I'll move into the role of hate speech and how things went. So just to position things in terms of where people are. We're talking about a community from that mustard-coloured part of Myanmar. You can see Mongdor would be almost the central part of the Rohingya's ancestral lands, but that mustard area, it's currently Rakhine state of Myanmar, formerly known as it was an independent kingdom called Arakan, and we'll get to that in a moment. But there's just a quick map just to give you a sense of where we're talking about. Who are the Rohingya? A Muslim minority. There's about 1 million. There were about 1 million of them, maybe 1.3 million living in Myanmar, in that part of the country adjacent to Bangladesh. Myanmar is an overwhelmingly Buddhist country. It's been 90% Buddhist. There's a small Muslim minority. There's a small Christian minority. The Rohingya are indigenous to Rakhine State, and I'll talk about that in a moment. They were brutally, forcibly deported, about 1 million forcibly deported to Bangladesh in 2017. They're still there. There's about, we're not quite sure on the numbers, but there's about 500,000 still within Myanmar, and they're either locked down in their villages or in concentration camps. So that their situation is pretty dire, and we don't get regular reports about or timely reports about their situation, but it is very, very bad. Here are the sorts of images that most of you will know when people talk about the situation of the Rohingya: a visibly distressed community, forcibly deported from Myanmar in very large numbers in 2017. Everything you see in these pictures was not there 6 weeks prior to that photo being taken, with the exception of the electrical wires, which don't serve the camp at all. They go somewhere else entirely. So you can see what 1 million people looks like. They've literally walked across an international border. This is October 2017. They're living beneath tarpaulin and religious kingdom is now part of an overwhelmingly Buddhist kingdom. But that didn't last for long, because 40 years later, they got the Burma fabric during the colonial period, and at independence, you can see, I'll just talk briefly here about the citizenship regime. It was an inclusive citizenship regime in 1948. The Rohingya were incorporated at that time too. Here's Myanmar's longest-serving prime minister, described U Nu. He was prime minister between 1948, various times between 1948 and 62, describing the Rohingya as an integral part of the country. This begins to change, though, from 1962 onwards. There's a military coup. So the country was unstable through the 1950s. You've got a real issue in terms of there were two communist insurgencies. There was the remnants of the Kuomintang coming into Shan State. The country is very unstable, and there is a military coup, and the military holds on to power basically from 1962 onwards. And these guys did not like anyone they regarded as foreign, and they regarded anyone who wasn't them, an ethnic Burmese as the majority ethnicity within Myanmar, and a Buddhist they regarded as suspicion, and a Muslim group claiming to be indigenous were not something that they would tolerate. And from 1962 onwards, the Rohingyas' experience of life in Myanmar declines dreadfully. U Nu was a psychopath. He was a very nasty person. You can read, I think The Economist has a pretty good, a pretty accurate obituary of what he was like, but his attitudes towards foreigners are basically the same as the current military of Myanmar. They regard the Rohingya, you see here, they regard the Rohingya not as indigenous and not from Myanmar. They call them Bengalis, they mean Bangladeshis, and they claim that they were brought in by the colonial British, which is not true. The Myanmar military wrote a citizenship law that privileged indigeneity, and they determined indigeneity was for groups, and it was for groups that were resident in the country prior to the beginning of the colonial period. Now, as we've seen, and they defined that as 1823. As we've seen, the Rohingya were there prior to 1823, but that hasn't mattered to the Myanmar military. So from 62 onwards, we get a series of rights violations that become increasingly worse. Restrictions on employment, marriage, forced labour, semi-regular pogroms. You see here, this is a Rohingya business in the main street of Sittwe town that's been just forcibly closed. The Rohingya aren't able to travel to the central part of town anymore, but you can see anti-Rohingya graffiti, reminiscent of some of the worst genocides that we would be familiar with. There was a political transition in Myanmar, seemingly post 2010, and there was an opening up of the country politically and economically, and into this stepped for the first time mobile phones and an open media. So prior to 2012, there were very tight restrictions on media. Foreign media was banned. Mobile phone SIM cards prior to 2010 would have cost about $2,000 US. This is in a country where the average household income at that time was about $300 US. So people couldn't afford a SIM card. Prices dropped to $1 US. I'm going to assume that some of you will know this guy and some of you won't. This is the Viber mascot. So Viber came into Myanmar very aggressively. At one point, I think there were two countries in the world where Viber was the primary messaging app. I think it was Brazil and Myanmar. But we see here the sorts of messaging app stickers that were being circulated. So it's, they're engaging with the local community. I mean, the top left there would be very clearly understood as an image from the Shwedagon Pagoda, and other sort of religious imagery as well. But we start to see things like this creeping in too. So Myanmar Martyrs' Day, and you can see Aung San Suu Kyi, you can see in the bottom left there. But Peaceful Myanmar is the one I want to draw your attention to. And Peaceful Myanmar includes on the right-hand side, a group of 8 very happy people celebrating together and being peaceful, and that they are 8 people, each representing an ethnicity within the country, and they're all wearing national dress. And the Rohingya obviously not included in that. You then see people like this chap. I describe him as almost like a conflict entrepreneur. Waratu was a Buddhist monk who became a sort of a Buddhist influencer within Myanmar, and his core objective was to remove Muslims from the country. Time magazine described him as the face of Buddhist terror, which he said was unfair because he had in fact described himself as the Buddhist bin Laden. And I mean, they're his words. Here's an image that he was circulating on his Facebook page. So this is the sort of material that becomes commonplace within Myanmar. Facebook arrives, and Facebook decides it will provide unmetered access to Facebook and unmetered access to news, so long as it's through the Facebook app. So Facebook very quickly became the dominant messaging app within the country, and figures like Waratu used the resources of Buddhism and donations that they could gain to circulate these sorts of messages, that it was a religious duty almost to oppose Muslims in any way that you could. There were bans on bans on trading with Muslims and those sorts of things. And of course, the Rohingya regularly described using shockingly dehumanizing language. I'll talk quickly, though, about what's going on with Aung San Suu Kyi during this period, because I think this is significant in terms of the environment that's been created within Myanmar. So many people would have thought that Aung San Suu Kyi would have defended the human rights of a group like the Rohingya, and that's not what happened. And I would contend that she is herself a nationalist, so her default position was not to be defending the rights of Muslim groups. However, there was a political reality as well, because she's leader of a very large political party, and there were not others in her political party that were standing up for the Rohingya. And I think that what contributed to that was the widespread sharing of anti-Rohingya narratives on social media that basically created an environment where it was all you would hear about the Rohingya were very negative things. And that was combined with state media, and here is statement. This is state media in Myanmar. This is basically a military-run newspaper. This is the English language thing. So this is what they want foreigners to read and diplomats to read. They have a Burmese language version that is much worse. So the language here around extremist terrorists ready to render assistance is one of the most disgusting things you'll ever see. That community that's on fire had been locked down and controlled. There were no Muslims in that place. There were no Rohingya in that place when this happened. It had been locked down and controlled by the Myanmar military for some time prior to this photo being taken. So they're rendering assistance by running a scorched earth campaign. But this was the political environment that the Rohingya were being forcibly deported from the country within. And this environment, this political environment, enabled by platforms like Facebook, who've taken no responsibility for their role in it, it enabled the Rohingya to be forcibly deported, genocidally deported from the country, with basically no domestic political opposition. And I think that's the thing that I think is the take-home message from all this. So the Rohingya as a community can go from being an integrated part of the national political fabric for hundreds of years, indigenous in the country, and then over time that can be changed, and it can be changed to a genocidal deportation and mass killing that went along with it in 2017. And now the lockdown of Rohingya within Rakhine State, where those that are still there are in their villages or in concentration camps. And there was no domestic political opposition to this occurring. And the message here is that if it can happen in that context, it can more or less happen anywhere. So I guess that's my warning about the role of hate speech and the role of unregulated social media platforms. And that's something that we've had. I mean, this is 2017. We're now in 2025. I would contend that there is absolutely nothing that would mean that what Facebook allowed to happen in 2017 couldn't happen again in Myanmar tomorrow, and likely very readily would. I'll just end it there and say that's look, thank you very much for the opportunity to present. And there's some contact details for me, but I'll stop sharing my screen. But if you want to get in touch, you can fairly readily find me. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ronan, for your enlightening presentation. We'll talk about a recent research that we conducted in Northern Justice Watch in partnership with Northern Justice Watch. And by looking at a case study, by looking at an impact on a specific community, I would like to talk about the impacts, like multi-layered impacts of hate speech on communities, individuals, societies, and internationally. Still.
I have to click once more to get your PowerPoint.
Can you click there? Okay, so I'll be brief in the background, but we all speak about the relationship between the language, the rhetoric that we use, especially used by the politicians, and hate crimes and more serious crimes. When we look at the literature, there is a long discussion on this. I'm not going to go deeper into the literature, but we can draw a pathway beginning from hate speech to hate crimes and then going up to more serious crimes like genocides and crimes against humanity. There's a very well-known, can you click again on the screen? There's a very well-known explanation of how genocides happen, and we listened to what happened in Myanmar and against the Rohingya genocide. The 10th stage of genocide starts with not with killing, not with mass killings or other violent crimes, but rhetoric or classification or hate speech or symbolization of certain groups. Like out of the 10 stage, we can say that the first 4 stage is somehow related to rhetoric, speech, and the conversations against certain communities. That's what happened in the Rwanda case. It didn't start with more than 1 million people died in Rwanda genocide in 100 days, but it didn't start with, again, killings. It started with hate speech against the Tutsis. And there are international tribunals for persecution of persons in this genocide. And it was underlined that the underlying acts of the crime of persecution includes hate speech against the Tutsis. And the same thing in the Holocaust. It didn't start with killings. It started with words. Like hateful languages could be seen in newspapers, textbooks, broadcast over radios, spoken in classrooms, and everywhere we can see that hateful language before the actual acts of genocide and killings started. And there was a social media campaign recently on this issue. It started with words, like they didn't start with violence and violent crimes, but it started with words. So that's a little bit background on what I want to speak about today, but I want to share the findings of our research study on a specific group, which is called Hizmet Movement. So just again, a bit background on Hizmet Movement. It's a faith-based network of individuals, organizations, and institutions. Basically, it was based in Turkey, but you can find their institutions, their schools, dialogue, and cultural centers in more than 100 countries. And the movement was inspired by the ideas of late Islamic scholar Fethullah Gülen, and they they basically argue a moderate and Sufi version of Islam, and they put an emphasis on interfaith dialogue. But what happened with this group recently in Turkey was very much like a genocide, like a social genocide, especially in the last 10 years, like a decade. Especially in 2013 and 2016, there were two important events that happened. In 2013, there was a huge corruption probe, a set of probes against the then Prime Minister Erdogan and his ministers. And after that, the government blamed this movement by plotting this as a coup against them. But indeed, there was really solid evidence about their corruptions. And since then, the political hate speech increased against this group. And it was disseminated by every means, as I said, like in the other genocides. And in 2016, there was a failed coup attempt. And still, there's a lot of discussion around this coup attempt, about who did this coup attempt. But the government didn't wait to blame the movement by plotting this coup attempt again. And the hate speech against the movement increased after this coup attempt. And what followed this coup attempt was a purge against the Hizmet movement. More than 2 million people were persecuted, over 600 people were detained, more than 500,000 people were arrested, passports were canceled, 300,000 officers were expelled from their positions, more than 3,000 judges and prosecutors were purged, more than 7,000 academics were dismissed. Like, it's a whole kind of social genocide against the movement started after this coup attempt. So what we did in this study was, what accompanied this purge was a specific hate speech against this movement, which is implicating the movement as a terrorist organization with a 4-letter word, FETO, like Fethullahist terrorist organization. The government and their partners blamed this movement by being a terrorist group and plotting these things against, and again, millions of people were put in the same box and they were blamed by using this specific hate speech. And we wanted to understand the multi-layered impacts of this hate speech at individual level, the community level impacts on public safety, and international impacts. By the way, since 2016, the members of the movement immigrated out of the country by different ways, and especially Western countries, and they sought refuge in these countries. And what we did was we collected data from more than 300 people in Canada who are affiliated with the Hizmet movement. And the majority of them live in Ontario. But we have, sorry, I didn't. Yeah, this is our sample, more than 300 people from different provinces, but mostly they live in Ontario. At individual level, we asked them what kind of hate crimes that they experienced since these events were happening, and especially with the impact of this hate speech. These were including institutional damage, the attacks from the criminal justice system in Turkey, but also the blue lines show the victimization in Canada. Sorry, the blue lines in Turkey, the red lines show the victimization percentage in Canada. As we see, like, the victimization obviously in Turkey is huge, but despite their refuge in Canada, they still continue to be a victim of online attacks, verbal attacks, property attacks, threats, and physical assaults, although it's not as big as the victimization percentage in Turkey. For example, 65% of our participants said they were victimized online, and 59% said they experienced in-person verbal attack. And we asked them what kind of changes did they experience in their lifestyle after being a victim of hate. And these include a wide range of lifestyle changes. For example, 80% of them moved abroad, 59% stopped hanging with people out of their community, 69% said they avoided walking in certain places, 60% said they improved their home security, and we see other types of life changes after being a victim of crime. So we used a tool that measures post-traumatic stress disorder, and 77% of the participants had a score which is higher than the threshold level, which is 40 out of 80. And the majority of them had more than that score, like the average score was 52 out of 80, which shows a great level of PTSD, which was caused by hate speech and hate crimes. And we asked them whether the use of this label, the 4-letter label, affected the hate crimes or incited hate crimes against them. 92% said the use of this word by politicians or other government officials incited online attacks against them. Again, verbal attacks as well, or property attacks, physical attacks similarly. Asking about the impacts on their individual and family lives, again, the majority of them said that the use of these hate words harmed their mental health. It caused them to have problems in their families, like 59% had problems in their families because of the use of this hate label. They had identity crisis. 55% said that they had identity crisis because of that. More than half, again, said it caused their children to drift away from them or to drift away from the Hizmet institutions and activities. And we asked community level impacts as well. Again, more than half or the majority of them said there is a huge impact on their communities, like the support for their institutions and activities are decreasing. And the supporters are excluded from the general society, in Turkey mostly, but even in Canada, 28% said they are excluded from the society because of this hate speech as well. There were impacts on public safety, especially in the form of polarization, as our speakers were talking about that. They said that there is an increasing polarization between other Turkish communities and Hizmet community in Canada, and even between Muslim communities and the Hizmet movement in Canada as well. More than half of that agreed with that statement. And majority of them agreed as well. There is a increasing concern about transnational repression activities of the Turkish government against the members of Hizmet movement in Canada, and those activities were also incited by the use of hate speech, according to the majority of our participants. So, to wrap up, as you see, there are individual level impacts, community level impacts, public safety impacts, transnational repression, which is international level impacts. So there is a multi-layer impacts of the use of hate speech against a specific community. So although it's a case study on a specific group who now live in Canada, the same things can be said about the other victim communities, as we will see tomorrow, or as we have already seen in the Rohingya case and other cases. Like hate speech is not just speech, it doesn't stay there. It leads to more serious crimes like hate crimes and atrocity crimes, and it goes up to genocide. Here is the statistics, as other speakers talked. In Canada, we have an increasing trend of hate crimes in the last decade. These are police-reported crimes. When we compare police-reported hate crimes and the victim surveys, only 22% of hate crimes are reported to police. So these numbers are not reflecting the real numbers. So we need to be really concerned about these numbers. When we look at the breakdown of different types of hate crimes, like racial, ethnic, religious, and other types of hate crimes are increasing similarly in the last decade in Canada. So what can we do to prevent this, to break that pathway from, sorry, I'm not switching my slides over there. So what can we do to prevent this pathway from hate speech to hate crime? First of all, we should increase the number of people who report hate crime, as Maryam was talking about. We should encourage that reporting process. We should educate ourselves and others about different communities and the impacts of hate speech on them. The antidote of hate speech is inclusive language. We should use that language, and we should encourage and promote that language, because as we see, words matter, and we should avoid hate speech in any ways. Supporting victims in terms of accessing to justice, in terms of dealing with their trauma, as Mariam was talking about and other speakers mentioned, is very important. So some policy recommendations about what the governmental institutions can do. First of all, recognizing the serious consequences of hate speech is really important. If there are any legal loopholes, as other speakers have discussed since the beginning of this conference, those loopholes should be addressed. Educating people, specifically law enforcement and the entire society, is really important. And legal responses and institutional responses may address these issues at some level, but I think that the most important response is community-led initiatives. What we are doing here, bringing together all the stakeholders, all the parties that are interested and affected by this problem, is really important to promote inclusion and to counter discrimination and polarization in our societies. So that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions for me, for Mariam, or for Dr. Lee, please feel free to ask.
Yours is a fairly long one, but I'll just quote the question, and I can just repeat myself if you need me to. So for you, the question is, does your office provide services for victims of war crimes where perpetrators have committed a crime elsewhere, but are then subsequently prosecuted here in Canada under the War Crimes Act? Here, I'm thinking of the Tutsi community that has helped track and open cases against perpetrators of genocide who are now freely living in Canada. The Tutsi community here is aware that Canadian investigators have traveled to Rwanda to continue advancing their case, but have never been updated by the police on their case progress at all. Does the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights appeal to the Tutsi community? Would your office be in position to help the Tutsi community and others like them? Which is somewhat of a legal question as well. So if you want to address the question personally afterwards, you're more than fine. Or I can pass the mic now as well.
Well, I can give some general...
Sure. It was a bit of a long one.
So I appreciate the question, and I'll just give some general comments on what we can address. So we can address, well, the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights applies to crimes that are committed in Canada, or if Canadian citizens are victimized abroad. And there is the Department of Justice, it's not from our office. And then when it comes to complaints that we can address, our mandate, specifically when it comes to like complaints resolution, it has to do with federal organizations that are not upholding the rights under the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights for victims of crime. So most of the complaints that we receive that we can do case management for and find resolution are around complaints against the Correctional Services of Canada, the Parole Board of Canada. So thinking about, you know, an inmate, maybe that an offender that's serving federal sentence more than 2 years, and that's being transferred from one institution to another, but a victim was not informed, although they were registered to receive that information. We know of cases like that. We've seen it in the media. That is like a complaint that we could address and work with Corrections Canada, Parole Board Canada to find a resolution. So thinking about federal agencies that have an obligation to victims of crime. So from the sounds of the question, no, we would not be able to address that. But definitely, like, we could try to look to see if there's any supports available in our network or from our agencies that we work with. So they can always send us an email.
Thank you. I think that's another purpose of these smaller, I guess, circles for people to be able to, you know, pass on the questions later on as well. And for you, Dr. Akça, so your case study demonstrates a situation where victims have experienced hate speech both back in their home country and after coming to Canada as well. In a situation like this, does this constitute a national security threat for Canada as well because of the continuity aspect, the transnational aspect of that hate speech?
Exactly. So the transnational repression part is something like that. It's a hot topic in the Canadian politics, actually, not just Turkey, but other countries like China, Russia, India. They have efforts to silence the voices, like the opponent voices in the diaspora. Hate speech is part of that, whether it's online or in person. And the incitement of those activities, for example, other Turkish communities in Canada, the members of those communities are, we know from the data, and I will share another part of the data tomorrow, the qualitative part of the data tomorrow in another presentation, shows that like those people are incited against the Hizmet movement members. They spy against the Hizmet movement members based on that hate rhetoric. Like that hate rhetoric encourages them to act against the members of the Hizmet movement. So it's actually a threat against the sovereignty of the Canadian government as well because of those activities. And again, our data shows Turkish consulate, staff of the Turkish consulate are involved in those activities. As we see, like the mosques are visited by some representatives, and the hate rhetoric is disseminated in those mosques, especially since 2016. So that's actually an impact of that hate speech.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mariam. And if you can still hear me, Dr. Lee, thank you for your presentation as well. Please give a final round of applause to all of our speakers.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you. And that, everyone, brings us to the end of our first day here at the University of Ottawa. As you know from the agenda, we will be here at the same time tomorrow morning with a very, very interesting, distinctive keynote speaker, the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights of the United Nations. She's going to be here tomorrow morning. We will have, if I'm not mistaken, 3 more panels after the keynote speech. Which is going to be another interesting day. On a more personal note as well, I apologize if I look slightly awkward on this side of the room. I've spent a good part of the last 3 years of my life being on the other side of this room, so it's a pretty memorable occasion for me as well to end my legal studies and to be doing this on my marriage anniversary. And I'd like to thank my wife for that as well, for accompanying me all the way from Toronto, not because she had to or because I asked her to, but because she wanted to, which tells you a bit of how the first year of our marriage has been like, but that's a side discussion. So thank you for being here, and thank you all for being here as well, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow morning. Have a good evening.